Good morning, Member Hendricks.
Good morning.
How are you?
Life is awesome.
I love it. Let's see. Alternate member Lee Aang, can we do a quick mic check, please?
Hi,
Good
Elaine.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Let me just.
Good morning, Member Montano. I can see you.
Good morning. Happy
And we can
Friday.
hear you. Great. Thank you. Carolyn, I know we saw your video. Can we do a quick mic check?
Paige is with me and will be there shortly.
Okay, thank you.
Rainey, can you please make me a co-host?
Gladly, yes.
Thank
of course.
you.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
No problem.
After we do roll call, I'm gonna get my glasses. It's hard to see on this computer.
Okay, you're a co-host now, Elaine.
Thank you so much.
You're
Thanks.
welcome.
Jason, can we do a quick mic check, please?
Hi, testing. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Elaine.
Alternate member Rennie, can we do a quick mic check, please?
Hello, hello, hello.
Hi, happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Jerry Jones, can we do a quick mic check, please? Good morning.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm happy it's Friday. Yay.
All right.
Thank you. We can hear you loud and clear.
So I'm testing now. Okay.
Yes, Carolyn, you came through clear. Thank you.
Greg, can we test your mic? Thank you. This is Rainey.
Absolutely. Greg Richardson. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. Mayor Licardo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, Austin. It's Rainey. Can we test your mic, please?
Testing. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Scott, can we do a quick mic check, please?
Sure. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. And Mr. Hale?
Good morning. How's
Good
everyone doing? Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Thank you. We can hear you loud and clear. Deborah?
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Member Paul, can we do a quick mic check, please?
Sure, hello.
Good morning. Pat, this is Elaine from the board office. Can we do a quick mic check, please? Pat Hagan. You're on mute, I think.
Good morning, I can hear you.
Yay, thank you. Member Otto Lee, can we do a quick mic check, please?
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Member Carrasco, can we do a quick mic check, please?
Check, check.
Thank you. Member Abicoga? Thank you. Sorry, Chair Jones, it's 9:01 and I believe we have a quorum now. We can get started whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Our workshop is now called to order. Thank you to my colleagues for taking the time to attend today's meeting. Elaine, roll call, please.
Abicoga? She's here.
Here.
Thank you. Blankley? Bert? Carrasco?
Here.
Chavez? Davis? Hendricks?
Attending.
Jane? Jimenez? Lee?
Present.
Lee Eng?
Here.
Ricardo?
Present.
Montano?
Here.
Paul?
Here.
Perales? Rennie?
Here.
Constantine? Chair Jones?
Present.
We have a quorum, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. I would like to ask the board, presenters, and members of the public to be mindful that we have 3 items on the agenda. I am encouraging you all to be concise when making your comments to ensure that we can discuss all the items on our agenda today. The first item on our agenda is item 2.1, an update on the future of the light rail system. I want to note that we will take public comments for this item at the conclusion of the presentation. Carolyn Gannott, General Manager and CEO, will introduce this item.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all attending today. I just wanted to say a few comments before we turn over into the presentation. One of the things that when I came on board and I talked to some of the board members about and the staff was at the time, the sort of the recently shown next gen study about light rail. And there was a lot of discussion about that and also some concerns about whether it fully looked at other alternatives. And I started looking into that study and started looking that we really need to sort of do a deeper dive and what's driving a lot of the discussion around light rail and the use of light rail and the future of light rail. And one of the things I did define in that VTA forward as part of the first phase of stabilization was really to define a process to assess the future of light rail and what some of the other alternatives may be. So I'm sort of stepping back a little bit from the next gen study and taking a deeper dive into some of the questions. And a lot of them revolve around what the cost is for light rail, why are our costs so high, how can we be more productive? And there's pieces on driving our costs down and getting our ridership up. And those are 2 separate elements. Today, most of the focus is on what we can do in terms of costs. and analysis of how to make our service more efficient, and maybe changes that we will consider. So this isn't, I would say, not something to be a panacea to answer questions today, but start to drive the conversation as to where we're going to go and the process we're going to take to start to answer some questions about the future of light rail. So I'm going to turn this over to Jason Kim, a senior transportation planning, who's been doing a lot of work, but I want to say this has been a very collaborative effort across the agency with operations, external affairs, asking the right questions, and the whole planning group as well. So there's a lot, and engineering as well. So we've all been discussing sort of this presentation, and primarily, it'll be two parts. One is primarily on light rail costs, and the next is the process for analyzing and going forward, and some various analysis of the system. So I'm going to turn this over to Jason. Thank you. Jason?
Great. Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, thanks, everyone. My name is Jason Kim, a senior planner here at VTA, and we're going to be discussing the future of the light rail system. If we move on to the next slide, we're going to briefly in the agenda today is to talk about the background on the next gen study, just to give you a high-level overview of what we looked at. Then we're going to talk about some program considerations for the system moving forward, provide some high-level details on some of our operating cost structures, and then, as Caroline mentioned, talk about some of the areas of analysis or essentially next steps that we want to look at moving forward. Next slide, thank you. So the next gen study was completed in mid-2021. The original goal is to examine if there were cost-effective alternatives to light rail for VTA, and we included both standard and non-standard technologies as part of this analysis. We had a number of findings from the study. If we go to the next slide, that we found a lot of interesting details. You know, our light rail system is one of the largest systems in the country, and it's one of the fastest systems in the country. We're roughly in the top third of both those categories. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. In addition, if we're looking at the future of our light rail system, I think one of the keys is that we will need to decide what to do with our fleet sometime within the next 3 to 7 years or so. And so while this makes it seem like a decision's coming up soon, which it is, we do have a couple more years to do some additional analysis before we really have to make a decision. I also want to note that with the alternatives that we were looking at, we did look at one alternative and how much it would cost to completely replace our light rail system with a fleet of VTA owned and operated buses. This also included essentially ripping out all of the light rail tracks, all 81 miles of it, and replacing that with essentially BRT style concrete bus lanes. We found that in our estimates, this wouldn't provide a return on investment for about 60 years, mostly due to the high costs of replacing that many miles of track with concrete. Finally, I think we want to note that light rail is being used very successfully in many areas, both throughout the country and really across the world as well. And the reason why at VTA we're looking to see if there is some other potential alternative is mostly because of our disproportionately high operating costs, especially when you compare us to our peers. And with that, I think we are going to focus on some of the cost numbers today. But if we go to the next slide, I believe I'm passing this back off to Carolyn to talk about some of our considerations moving forward for the system.
So some of the questions that we're asking today, or asking today and start to move forward in the analysis, is really the thing that we always ask is we don't look as efficient because of our costs are so high. So a couple of these questions revolve around that. How do we really efficiently serve our current customers, and then what we expect for the future? And one of that is what is our future customer base going to look like, considering the way the transit pattern, the pandemic has made a change. How is that going to go forward in how people travel? So that'll be one of the things we'll need to look at. And really, how should we continue to invest in the light rail system? And I think Jason can give a little more context. We are one of the larger light rail systems in the country right now, and we actually have one of the higher speeds, average speeds, even though it does feel slow through the downtowns in certain sections. And we're actually one of the higher speed light rail systems in the country as well. But one of the things we need to figure out is how do we reduce the ongoing operating costs? And the next set of slides will really talk about how the cost breakdown that we're seeing, and where we might want to really do some detailed analysis as to how we can maybe get some of those costs down and bring them in line, at least with where other agencies are, and what makes sense. And then what changes do we need to make any future system we have the best opportunity to succeed? Some of that we can do in terms of the costs and the efficiencies and how we move forward and processes that we put in place. But a lot of this also is so much in partnership with the cities as well, in terms of their land uses and where those get placed, and then also how we connect to our light rail system. So how do we support that as VTA? How do other systems support that? And then what we really want to dig to is which portions of the light rail system work well and what areas should be targeted for potential improvements. The other thing we're going to continue to do is look at other alternatives. There's definitely changes in the rail system, in the rail vehicle market, so that maybe there's less infrastructure needed or different kinds of infrastructure that are needed that might be more cost efficient. So those are things we'll look at, as well as any other, do we look at some kind of rubber tire in the future if we really can't see costs and costs going down and ridership going up on light rail. So I'm going to turn this back over to Jason to talk a little bit about the cost section.
Great, thanks, Caroline. So yeah, we're going to start by providing a brief high-level overview about some of our operating costs. And this is really just scratching the surface of the data. As Caroline mentioned, over the next couple of years, or really months, we're going to be doing a lot more detailed analysis on some of the data we'll be showing you today. I also want to note that this is all based on pre-pandemic data from 2019. That's really the last year where we felt like we had kind of a normal operating cost number to work with, as well as other agencies. And this is all from data from the National Transit Database. This is a publicly accessible database. So really anyone from the public could download the same set of data we downloaded and derive a lot of the same numbers that we'll be talking about today. If we go to the next slide, the metric we're going to be using today is operating cost per revenue car hour. So what does that mean? That is, if you take our entire light rail operating budget and divide it by the total number of hours our cars are out there operating revenue service. So picking passengers up, moving them around, and dropping them off. And for this metric, essentially a 2-car train counts as 2 hours. The reason why we're using this metric is it's a really good indication of overall wear and tear on our system. So when we use this metric, VTA has the highest average costs in the country. San Jose is all the way on the right side of this chart. And this chart also shows all the different light rail agencies in the country right now. We're about 70% above the national average. But the key here, as Carolyn mentioned, is what areas are our costs high and what areas are our costs actually closer to average. If we go to the next slide, first area we want to focus on is our operator-related costs. And so this is related to all the costs for paying our operators' wages, their respective benefits. It's also a function of the total number of hours they're working and their average car lengths they're operating. But in general, for these costs, we're the 5th highest in the nation. We're only about 35% above the national average, which we think would make sense for the cost of living in our county. And we should also note that this is only about 11% of our total operating budget for light rail. So when you really think about it, when you think about our light rail costs, we pay our operators a certain amount of wages and benefits, and then we pay about 9 times that for every other related costs to operating the light rail system. If we go to the next slide, one of the areas where we are the highest in the nation is our all other staffing related costs. So this is all staff related to supporting the light rail system. This includes maintaining the vehicles and maintaining our tracks and our overhead power systems, as well as our signaling system. This even includes administrative and management costs associated with helping to operate the light rail fleet. So for these costs, we are the highest in the nation. And also for most agencies, this cost area is really the largest cost area. So we're about 80% above the national average. And this is one of those areas that we really do want to do a more focused analysis on moving forward. Move on to the next slide. One of the other key areas that we want to look at are our parts and materials costs. So while these bars look small compared to the other 2 bars that we looked at, this is a really important one for VTA. So in terms of parts and materials, we are the highest in the nation, and we're more than twice the national average in terms of how much we spend on parts and materials for our light rail fleet. I should also note that this is about 11% of our total operating budget, and it's actually slightly higher than the total amount that we pay our operators and their respective benefits. And finally, if we go to the last chart, this is kind of a catch-all for everything else related to operating the light rail system. So costs related to traction power, taxes, insurance, all the other categories that the National Transit Database collects. Regarding these costs, we're about the 5th highest in the nation. I think the key here is that none of these costs are really that extraordinary for VTA. None of them stand out significantly to us. And so the key here is that when we're looking at the areas where we are well above average, none of these areas really stick out to us too much. So The two cost areas that we will be focusing more on going forward are our other non-operator wages, as well as our parts and materials costs. If we move on to the next slide, we do want to essentially change topics quickly and talk about light rail costs versus bus operating costs. One of the keys that we've been talking about with the board is this idea about what it would look like to replace our light rail system with a respective bus service instead. So we want to talk with the board about what that might actually look like, but also just go into some details about when it makes sense to operate light rail, when it makes sense to operate buses, and really what the whole purpose of a light rail system is in a lot of ways. So if we move on to the next slide, this chart shows light rail and bus operating costs for a handful of what I would consider our closest peer agencies. These are all the West Coast agencies that have both bus and light rail service. And so while VTA has the highest average light rail costs in the country for light rail, our bus operating costs are actually well above average as well. And you are considering what it would look like to replace light rail service with bus service. The key is not just how much they cost, but also their cost in relationship to each other. So at VTA, light rail costs about 3 times that per hour than average bus costs. Or one way to think about it is you can run 3 hours of bus service for the same amount that it costs to run 1 hour of light rail service. For most other agencies, this ratio is closer to 2 to 1. So most other agencies have a lower ratio than us. But the big point here, though, is light rail is a high capacity transit system that could hold many more passengers than a typical bus can. So while light rail costs somewhere between 2 to 3 times more than a standard bus does, it can hold up to 8 times more passengers. And so for light rail, there's a point where when you have enough passengers on a light rail train, it becomes more cost effective for light rail than a replacement bus service. If we move to the next slide, thank you. This chart is trying to show the relationship between the number of vehicles, their respective capacity for passengers, and their respective costs. So a bus at VTA, a typical bus, can hold about 45 passengers. This is kind of an average passenger load. It's not quite packed in like sardines, but it's also a pretty full bus. And then when you look at the cost of that bus, about 1/3 of that goes to paying the operator and the respective benefits. And then about 2/3 of it goes to paying for all the maintenance of that related to that bus. When you look at a 1-car light rail train, which is the next line, it holds about 120 passengers comfortably. This is a higher capacity than our passengers are typically used to, but it's actually well below what you would see at, say, a Levi Stadium event service, where we're packing probably more than 150 people per light rail vehicle in those cars. As I mentioned, though, our costs are very high, and so when you look at a light rail vehicle's costs, about 10% or 11% of that goes to pay the operator, and then we're paying significantly more in other maintenance costs associated with that vehicle. So when you look at a 1-car light rail vehicle that can hold about 120 passengers, you would need about 2.5 buses to replace that amount of capacity. So yeah, and then the respective cost for 2.5 buses is a little bit less than 1 light rail car. So at VTA, a 1-car light rail train costs more to operate than 2.5 buses. However, as light rail trains get bigger and longer, and you're serving more passengers, light rail costs tend to scale better. And so the key here is trying to figure out where light rail starts costing less per passenger than a standard bus does. And for VTA, that tipping point is really a 3-car train. So if you go to the last line, a 3-car train can hold about 360 passengers, and it's slightly cheaper than operating 7.5 buses, which is what you would need to serve 360 passengers. So VTA's tipping point is a 3-car train. But if we move to the next slide, we want to show you what this would look like if we got our costs down to something closer to the national averages. For most other agencies, that tipping point is actually a 2-car train. So for most other agencies, a 2-car train is actually starts to become significantly cheaper than operating 5 buses. And so for every other agency, their tipping point where light rail is more cost efficient is a 2-car train. So if we move on to the next slide to hopefully summarize all this that we just talked about. For VTA, light rail service is really cost effective when we're operating a 3-car train. Typically, we only see 3-car trains in our county during large stadium event services. For most other agencies, a two-car train is really when light rail is being cost effective. And that is a standard vehicle length for most peak period trips. Even at VTA, some of our more productive areas require two-car trains during peak periods. Specifically, the segment from South San Jose to downtown San Jose. It's a pretty normal occurrence, at least pre-pandemic, to see, a two-car train full of people either dropping passengers off or picking them up in downtown. However, I will admit that for the rest of our system, especially during off-peak periods, we may not exactly need that capacity that light rail provides us, at least not today. However, looking forward, we do expect some need for a high-capacity transit system in our county for the future. As Carolyn mentioned, there's going to be a lot of changes in our county, a lot of potential market changes in terms of the passengers that we're serving, a lot of also key infrastructure changes in our county, including BART Phase 2 and high-speed rail and Caltrain service changes, which are really big key drivers for ridership on our light rail system. And so really the question that we're examining at VTA is if light rail is the high-capacity transit system that we are looking at for the future, how do we get our costs down something closer to the national average? And so that's really the question that we're kind of starting to look at today. I believe now we are going to take a quick break to see if there are any clarifying questions from the board.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure they understand so the two areas we're seeing costs higher is parts, which we do have a parts task force, and we'll talk about that later, that has been working on this. The other is sort of those other costs other than operator costs. And those are anything from, specific, somebody dealing with maintenance all the way through the admin. And so a lot of it is also looking at process issues and areas like that, and that's one thing I will say that bringing Greg on as the CFO, we're really starting to look at some of our processes and efficiencies in those, and we'll continue to do that as well. So I think those are the areas we really need to look at, is some of those soft costs as well, and how we administer things in terms of moving, supporting the light rail system. So anyways, I think Jason's correct. We want to know whether we'll pass this over to the chair if you want to take questions now or wait after the second portion.
No, we'll go ahead and take questions now. Before I go to my board colleagues, I have a question on slide 14. So your analysis, if I have the correct understanding, is based on full capacity for the buses and light rail. Have you done a separate analysis based on actual ridership for the two modes of transportation?
You're correct. So this is based on capacity. We haven't done an analysis on actual ridership yet. That's one of the next steps that we could be doing kind of after this part of the study, or at this part of the analysis.
I do think we do have some sense of when we, as Jason mentioned, when we need two-car trains pre-pandemic and what we need to do. We have not really fully seen what BART can do for the county until the commute patterns potentially will hopefully change back, or there's more use and more connections. That's one of the areas that we'll be looking at as well. So we really don't know what this is going to be like 3, 4, 5 years from now, but those connections to the regional rail systems and bringing BART into San Jose will be a major connection, bringing high-speed, if high-speed rail comes, which hopefully, I hope it does, comes into San Jose, and those connections as well when Caltrain is electrified and those speed changes will all drive light rail ridership.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just don't know how, looking at, a comparison based on full capacity, knowing that our vehicles aren't at full capacity gives us a true picture of the actual cost. So I just want to make that point, and that's one of the concerns that I have. And I'm going to go to Director Hendricks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So just to kind of follow along with that a little bit, is this looks like it's a standard size bus as opposed to one of the elongated buses? And if we were using those, does that change these numbers?
Yeah, this is a standard size bus. If we use an elongated bus, like an articulated bus, it would change these numbers a little bit, but those costs related to an articulated bus versus a 40-foot bus also do change a little bit. So it would kind of just be another row in this sheet if we want to add that. But the takeaway point doesn't change that much, that light rail is really more effective for VTA when we are operating this 3-car train.
Okay. And then I would just also make the observation, somebody started by saying we have a decision to be made in 3 years or something like that. I would actually say that's extremely close. For what it takes us as an organization to go through and make a decision and public outreach and everything that's involved, I would say that's a very close timeline, and we need to probably move a lot faster on this than what anybody thinks. It just our ability to make snap decisions, I don't think that exists right now. So I would just, from a timing perspective, I think this is we need to get moving faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Abakoga.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I had similar question as the chair in terms of capacity on this slide, but I also noticed that the cost differential at even the 2-car train is, is pretty close, or it's not a big gap. So I'm assuming your next part you're talking about, or you're going to be looking at cost savings, and perhaps that would affect these bars to make it so that the 2-car train might be more cost effective. Just in terms of, for me, I was thinking just in terms of capacity, like it's great to run 3-car trains if we can fill them, but I'm not sure we're there yet. So is that what you would be looking at? Are there different, I'm assuming there are different costs with light rail and bus service, that you could reduce the light rail cost to make it a similar cost?
Yeah, maybe I'll note, if we go to slide 15, this is what a standard agency typically costs. And I think this is really the cost areas that we're trying to improve to, essentially, where a 2-car train is cheaper to operate than 5 buses. So this is kind of the goal that we're heading towards.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see other hands raised. So Jason, continue with your, wait, I see Director Montano.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it seems that really the problem is that you're not getting enough ridership on these light rail. And it all has to do with speed. It goes back to speed. People, people's time is important, and people don't want to waste their time being on the road. For example, right now we have Bart Milpitas, but it's empty. No one's using it. And we could say it's because of COVID, but even then no one is, I don't see an increase there of the ridership of BART, because to be honest with you, it doesn't go to where the jobs are at. And the jobs are in Sunnyvale, Mountain View, Cupertino. The majority of those jobs are in those areas, but we don't have a system in place where the light rail goes directly to it. It does, but it just takes so long. So people wind up taking their cars. I see that here you have the buses can, on the 2-passenger, I think the buses can take folks there. However, if we replace the light rail in lieu of the buses, it'll be more cost effective with the buses. However, that's just something needs to be done with this speed versus the time to get to people's job. And I don't know what it takes. Maybe elevate the light rail system, just use buses put the light rail system on hold, use the buses until we can get those. I'm just thinking out of the box, get those light rail system elevated, the tracks or whatever you call it, make it higher. But I don't know if that's cost effective either. So I guess we'll all have to just keep on thinking out of the box and try to find some solutions. So anyway, yeah, I do think we do need a study in kind of going with Chappie's question about has there been a study of what areas in the county are more, is light rail being more used highly? So I haven't seen that yet, but that would help me in terms of my making decisions. So, all right, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Burke.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm by phone today. So on a follow-up question on this whole question of the speed of the system, is staff going to be looking at the issue of the number of stops and how stop frequency may actually reduce the speed of the whole system and the attractiveness of riding light rail. Is that something that will be looked at?
Yeah, I'll just note that for both board members, Bird and Montano's comments, that we are doing some additional analysis on different segments of our system, and we'll actually discuss that in the final part of the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Liccardo.
Thank you, Chair. I was just hoping, is it possible to reserve these questions or my questions for the end? I just wanted to make sure I wasn't precluded from asking questions at the very end.
Yes, you can ask your question at the end.
Okay, great. I'll wait then. Thanks.
Okay. And I don't see any other hands. So Jason, continue with your presentation.
Great, thank you, Chair Jones. So yeah, we'll be talking about the areas of analysis that we'll be moving forward into, really to develop a plan to reduce our ongoing operating costs and just provide better service on our light rail system. We have three key areas: evaluating our existing operating practices and maintenance practices, conducting evaluations on different portions of our light rail system to see how we can better serve those areas, and then monitoring and reporting back on new and innovative technologies moving forward. The first area that we want to look into is our operations and maintenance practices. One of the keys here is really starting to collect better data on some of our operating costs. As I mentioned, in that one bar chart with basically all the support staff for light rail, we don't have a good sense of how that all breaks up in that category, and we would like to collect better data to better analyze those costs. Additionally, Carolyn mentioned that we have started a parts task force to better understand how we are procuring our parts and essentially making more efficient use of our parts for our light rail fleet. I should note that this is really an effort that has, including many different parts of the organization. This includes operations, includes procurements. I should also note that we have been in touch with the unions regarding this as well, and really just this entire process of making potential changes to our light rail system and our practices. So we're just making sure that we keep the unions involved with all potential changes. If we move on to the next slide, I want to mention two potential operating changes that may allow us to both reduce our costs and just extend the life of our fleet. One of the ideas, we have two ideas to potentially reduce our ongoing operating mileage on our fleet. This would potentially essentially allow us to get more life out of our fleet because we're running less miles on them annually, and reduce our overall wear and tear and operating costs. The two ideas, this is something that was mentioned with earlier presentations, is operating more one-car trains for our system. As we mentioned, we don't need two-car trains everywhere on our system today. And if we run more one-car trains, we could potentially reduce the wear and tear and extend that decision timeline out that we have from 3 years to maybe 5-6 years or so. Additionally, we want to look at the spans of service on our system. Right now, we're operating light rail from about 5 a.m. to 1 a.m. So potentially, if we reduce our light rail service, maybe cut the last couple hours of light rail service off at the end of the day, replace that with a bus service that's cheaper to operate, we could potentially save some operating budget as well as reduce the overall miles. For both these changes, though, the key here is to conduct some passenger surveys, do a lot of outreach to make sure if these make sense for our passengers. I also want to note that we really probably would not start this process until post-pandemic, at which point it may make sense to actually talk about crowding on a light rail vehicle. And so these are probably topics that will be coming up more likely after the pandemic is over. If we move to the next slide, something that was brought up is system evaluations for our system. We want to better understand how to operate segments that are either historically underperforming for us or challenging to operate. So we have 4 different areas that we kind of keyed into for our first initial analysis of the light rail system. This is going to include looking at light rail plans for these, or operating plans for these areas, figuring out how much it costs to maintain these areas currently, and really just thinking about, is there a better way to operate these segments, including maybe even looking at a different technology. So we want to detail just some of these segments briefly. So if we go to the next slide, the first segment that we're going to be looking at is downtown San Jose. This is pretty well known to be the slowest part of our system. We have a very unique track configuration here. And we are hoping to look at different ways to realign the tracks in downtown. This could include putting both tracks on a different street. It could also include a much more larger infrastructure project, such as grade separating the tracks, or even putting the tracks on a bypass of downtown to get those system speeds up. And so we have started scoping this project now, and we're going to begin the study a little bit later this year. Moving on from the downtown study, there's 3 other areas that we'll be looking into. The first includes the tracks essentially from Campbell up to Diridon Station. Diridon is a major regional connection for us. But this portion of the track is very challenging for us to operate. It's a very unique track configuration. And so we want to better understand, is there a better way to operate the system and make it more efficient for us in this area? If we go to the next slide, this is a portion of our system that is very unique. It has very circuitous routing. While it looks like a straight line on the map, this is actually the windiest part of our system with lots of twists and turns. And so we want to better understand how to serve the riders here, serve the Caltrain connection at the Mountain View Station. I believe someone mentioned that this is actually an area with a lot of employment here that we want to make sure that we can better understand how to serve and create better direct connections to. And then the last segment on the next slide is the east side of our system. This essentially is the light rail tracks south of the BART connection at Milpitas BART. This is a relatively slow segment due to a lot of the signal priority issues we have here. It's also relatively low density compared to some of the other portions of our system. And this will also include the future East Ridge extension. So we want to better understand how to better serve this corridor for our passengers as we move forward into looking at our ongoing light rail operating costs. Finally, the last kind of key area that we want to focus on moving forward for the light rail system is continuing to monitor new and emerging technologies, both for standard modes like bus and light rail, but also some of these non-standard technologies that are out there. We want to make sure that we're continuing to partner with other agencies and companies to see what's out there, what's applicable to VTA, and what we want to keep the board notified of as these technologies progress. So we plan to report back to the board somewhat regularly as we find other technologies out there that we would like to keep the board aware of. Finally, this is just a kind of a high-level schedule of where we think some of these tasks are going to slot in. I think the thing to note is that we are trying to do a lot of work within the next couple of years to really start answering this question about what to do with our light rail system. And the one thing I want to note here that we haven't really talked about today is the last line, the ridership growth strategies. Carolyn mentioned that this is kind of a hand-in-hand with both operating costs and ridership growth. And so while we focus on the costs today, we do have a number of other efforts that we are focusing on to try to increase our ridership over the next couple of years that we'll be implementing. And so with that, I think I do want to hand it back off to Carolyn to give some concluding thoughts.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that if you go, and Jason, can you go back to the slide where it shows all the analysis that we're going to do on the full one? I think when we start to look at, I think it's the slide, I don't remember what the slide
I think
is.
there's a couple more slides. This one? Oh.
That one, perfect. So one of the things is starting to do a more in-depth analysis of each of these areas. I'm not saying that that the answers for all of them will be different. Part of them is looking at the service plans and do for each of these. Are there ways to make it work better? It doesn't mean that we won't. One of the things I want to look at, and one of the things Jason mentioned at the beginning, is right now there's not a newer technology. A new technology right now that could operate over the entire system, and what we want to know is, would we ever do that? And are there some technologies that work better in maybe some of these other areas of our light rail system, or in other corridors within our county, or connected corridors in our county? So that's part of the analysis. So I'm just saying from my view, because at the top, we could look at this and say, okay, does another alternative serve this better than light rail? And so those are some of the things that we're going to look at. Will the east side work better if we really get the signal priority? Because we're finding out if speeds are higher and they make those connections to the regional markets like BART or to Caltrain, we can actually, that actually is a high ridership driver for people to want to take it. So those are things we got to take a look at. And then also, we haven't focused on it today, as we mentioned. We didn't focus on exactly looking at the metrics on the ridership. I know we're doing the fiscal sustainability study. The AG is doing that. And he'll focus on some of those things from NTD that are also metrics for passengers. And that's going to be coming soon to the Governance and Audit Committee. But I just want to say that, you know, there's each of these analysis isn't going to be exactly similar because they're very different markets, they're different characteristics. So this is something that we're going to do. We're going to be coming through, and then we'll probably be bringing information from this back to the board, but probably also through SSTP&O committee and bringing the information. So we will be taking a look at these. They're all very different how they operate. But the core system actually operates fairly well outside of some transit signal priority improvements in the northern section of First Street and over the Levi Stadium. But we really want to take a look at these other areas and to see, is there an alternative that would work? And then is there something in the future that should be done overall for the light rail system? So I think that was a long-winded way of ending that presentation or to go towards questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Jason. We will now take public comment for item 2.1. Rainey, do we have any requests to speak?
Yes, actually, we do have, Mr. Chair. However, I'd like to take note that we have received written comments from Mr. Globus and Mr. Jim Stallman, which are already posted on the portal. And we just recently received Mr. Beekman's written comment also, which will be posted later after the workshop meeting. I'm going to start calling on our speakers. Mr. Bradley, you may begin speaking when you're ready.
Morning, board members. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
This is Eugene Bradley, founder and CEO of the Silicon Valley Transit Users. Just watching this entire great presentation, I echo Mr. Stallman's letter and the content in it, asking for VTA to pursue state cap and trade funding to help provide the power to the light rail trains through the overhead wiring. Also, one thing I noticed that was not in that study, has VTA considered actually converting at minimum the Waterloo Bay light rail yard and have that fully run by solar power? I feel that VTA should at least compare looking at converting that yard from actually grid power into solar power to get our power from the sun. It's only going to be there for the next 5 billion years. Also, I echo Ms. Montalvo's comments regarding need for speeding up the light rail, particularly First and Younger. VTA needs to look at grade separating that as well as doing so to a couple other places, help speed up these trains. More in the written letter. Thank you.
Next speaker, Mr. John, you may begin speaking when you're ready.
Good morning, everybody. This is John Courtney, President Business Agent from ATU Local 265. I just want to point out, first off, y'all kill me with this 1 minute public comment thing. I speak fast enough already, but I can't even keep up. There, I just wasted 5 seconds. You know, I want to say that there are no innocent victims here. You all had an opportunity to fix the problem at Light Rail in previous years. You've been on the board, you've been in part of the politicians in the area, and instead of throwing mud the entire time, we should have been looking at options. And I'm so happy to hear Carolyn discuss options with what we have in existence now to improve, and then we see where we go from there. I think that's the most responsible thing to do, because there are other cities who would love to have the infrastructure that we already have. And I'm very happy to participate in all of that. There is no mode of transportation that's going to increase ridership. So please keep that in mind.
Thank you, Mr. John. Mr. Beekman, you may begin speaking when you're ready.
Hi, thank you. Blair Beekman here. You know, there can be a fleet of smaller buses that can have bus routes that can work together in concentric circles of 5 to 10 miles in diameter, and that can center around VTA light rail stops of Santa Clara County. And from this, some bus routes with larger buses can then cover longer distances along Santa Clara County roadways. This can invite shorter bus travel distances, less gas use, and less wear on buses. This can also invite better community cooperation and community practices and refocus how to make the light rail the center of transportation in Santa Clara County. As we may be heading towards a future of light rail and buses using automated vehicle technology, this should not be at the expense of current open and creative good ideas of community practices. The future of biometric camera technology needs to be very clear, open, and accountable, as these are the ways to help.
And that concludes the public speaking period, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We will now close public comment. I'll open it up now for board discussion. So I'm looking for raised hands. Director Rennie.
Thank you, Chair. Actually following on what Mr. Courtney said, I think the reason we're having a productive discussion today is I think staff has done a really good job of identifying the right places that we need to put effort into. And we've talked about them before, but now I'm seeing a much more comprehensive report. So I really want to thank, I guess, with Carolyn's leadership, that we're really digging into the right places. We've talked about downtown, and I like the fact that you're thinking about, a lot of different changes to make the downtown more effective. And Carolyn said in the beginning also that there's a lot of changes coming in the next 5 years when downtown starts getting built up with Google. I think it's really going to activate the things that run south out of the light rail that runs south out of downtown. And I like the fact that you were looking at some of the density, and I'm wondering if we could start having some discussions with some of the cities about building more density around the current light rail. I think the thing to keep in mind is, we need a fast backbone, and you're looking at, you mentioned lots of different ways to speed it up. And that again has been something that we've been talking about for a while. Further in the future, and I also like this focus on, okay, where are the costs and reducing, looking at parts task force. So I really think you're doing a lot of good things. The one thing I would add for further in the future, once we better understand how the Valley is building out different with the BART coming in and Google building downtown and so forth, I would hope that we could do a whole region kind of analysis where you kind of say, well, if I had a blank slate, what areas need to be connected? I know we're stuck with sort of an infrastructure we have, but for the more distant future, and we had capital investment coming from somewhere, where would we add to the system that would actually enable a lot more ridership in the rest of the system? Clearly we're going to Mountain View, that's a job center, so that's good, but we're not getting to Cupertino, for example. There's a lot of jobs there. So I know all the things you're looking at now are the right first steps, but I also want us to try to think a little further into the future. How can we enable the whole system better by maybe particular adds to big job centers that aren't, with the fast backbone, job centers that aren't accessed now? Thank you.
Thank you, Director Apikoga.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, thank you. I appreciate this presentation. I think we looked at light rail maybe a year ago, and I really appreciate this new and improved presentation, and going back and doing a more comprehensive review of the changes that we can make. Along similar lines as Director Rennie, I guess when I think about light rail, and of course I'm at the tail end in Mountain View, I think about like where light rail goes and how patterns have changed over time, since the beginning when light rail was first built. And I'll give an example. There's a station at NASA, and my understanding is I think maybe we get 100 people there a day or not. And it's sort of in the middle of nowhere. So we as a city have had to figure out how to connect it to the current job center areas. So my question, is will we be able to look at that, look at is there a possibility of moving where the station locations are? Like we have one that, for instance, if we had moved that NASA station maybe a half a mile, it would actually be central to one of our job centers. So is there that kind of flexibility in this plan? And then the other, I guess, question is, as you all, you know, we have done our own study on automated guided transit. And so it wouldn't be replacing a light rail, but is there a way to, add, to expand by using these other technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna let Jason speak to this, but yeah, I think some of the questions you have about stations, I know in the downtown, we're looking at that. Do we consolidate or change? That's a possibility. I mean, one of the things is to take a look at capital projects that would support the operations better and help with ridership. Those would be things that we're taking a look at. We're looking at a turn back Hostetter so that we can serve, be able to serve BART differently and maybe in a different way. So those are different things that we're taking a look at to support that effort. Jason, do you want to have?
Yeah, I think to add to what Carolyn's saying, we do want to consider capital projects that we think would reduce ongoing operating costs. So if there are potential changes to stations that have been brought up earlier today, I think we're willing to look at all of those items. I think especially specifically in key areas like that NASA Bayshore area with one of our areas of focus we're moving forward with. Also just note that, we've been working with the city of Mountain View on that AGT study. And so, yeah, we're happy to continue connecting with them on it. Not really sure how applicable that is for specifically to our light rail system, but we do know that that's going to be a pretty good connection for us at the downtown Mountain View area.
Yeah, so for that study, one of the possibilities or a question I had was whether we can create a connection from the NASA station of North Bayshore, because that's the real challenge. Is North Bayshore is our job center, but we have no transit. As you know, we have no transit to get there. I believe there was a light rail study that would happen to, and I'd have to go back and look at all that. But how do we, kind of going back to what Director Montano was saying, is how do we get to the job centers? And then actually in relation to that, a long time ago, I remember double checking the Mountain View section. I think in preparation, we had the little T and the big T. This was like 10 years ago. And I was really excited about express service to get Mountain View, but I don't think it ever happened. And I was just wondering what happened there. And is there a possibility of that, those types of changes occurring to speed up service, so we can get folks. And someone mentions stops.
I think I agree with you. I think there's a lot of opportunities there. That that's an area. Does light rail serve that area best, or should light rail be different? We definitely want to connect to Caltrain. We want to connect to the main system. But is there something that can be done differently? We don't know that, or to the Mountain View station where Caltrain is. I think light rail would want to get there. Does it stay with where it is to do that? I don't know. And then how do we make those connections? You're right, because the North Bayshore Center, we've been working with your staff on that. So I think it's important to take a look. That's why each of these areas are so different than the other ones. But there are some synergies, and that's what we have to take a look at. So
great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Director Lee. Go ahead and take yourself off mute. All right, we'll come back to Director Lee. We'll come back to Director.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just sorry. I was on another phone call. I just thought, sorry about that. The question I have is, I guess, is more of a fundamental question. I've said this to Rod Dearden Sr. when the first light rail was built. It's like, thanks so much for your great work for coming up with the system as the father of transportation of Silicon Valley. One question I have the concern about is really just how slow light rail is in downtown, and why they didn't think of getting it underground or at least rate separated so that we go a lot faster. Because part of the reason why it was so slow is because of this, crossing so many streets, and the cars that we see almost daily that drive right into First or Second Street, especially Second Street, where a lot of people get confused with the the road weights and the light rail. So the speed certainly significantly reduced. If we're talking about capital project, is it even at all feasible what the cost would be to try to get that grade separation put in place in some of those locations so that we could actually speed up the movement of light rail in the downtown area? Just a thought to throw out. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Hendricks.
Yeah, thanks. Some other people have brought this up. I would just like to make sure that as staff is looking at how they're going to change service, they're taking into account and reaching out to the individual cities to see what plans are along the light rail lines. Sunnyvale has 2 stations in the Moffett Park area. And I know some people are concerned that, you know, those used to be 2 of the highest boarding lines with all the people at the businesses in Moffett Park. And right now it's not. But the city of Sunnyvale is also looking at updating its Moffett Park specific plan and looking at putting 20,000 housing units and in that specific area, mostly because of the ability that the light rail line goes through there, which is going to change the whole pattern of usage of what goes on. And I just want to make sure that when we talk about how we want to change service for light rail, we take into account how cities are planning around the light rail service. And, you know, I would hate to be in a spot where Sunnyvale's planned for lots of housing near light rail, and then all of a sudden light rail service is not what we thought it was going to be. So just please keep that in mind.
Thank
So
you.
one of the things that I just want to mention, I think that's really one of the things we will be doing is working with each of the cities, because the model doesn't, if you look at our basic model, it doesn't have a lot of the things that the cities are looking at now in terms of land uses. It's not incorporated into the base regional model that we have. But I do think that one of the things also is giving us, do we do some flexibility right now where we don't run light rail during certain times of the day and we run buses and then we build it back up? Do we get rid of that infrastructure? Do we think what we need to do? Those are the things that we're going to be looking at for the short term as well.
Yeah, I think that's great. If I can just add, you know, sometimes we go ahead and we put some, you know, housing or businesses somewhere and say, let's try and get public transit to go there. And this is just an example in Sunnyvale where here the public transit is there and we're trying to put the housing where it is to take advantage of it. So thank you.
Director Montano.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was wanted to follow up on Director Abekoga's comments about that one segment where it's like in no man's land and the people have to drive there to get to work. But perhaps, and I'm glad with Carolyn's leadership, we can think of something, maybe phase in some type of high, you spoke about some different technologies. Perhaps that could be one of the areas where we can use or look into using new technology that's out there that will help the employers get to and from work. So yeah, that's what I wanted to mention. And I also had the opportunity to attend the APTA, I think it's APTA conference a couple of weeks ago. And this is an opportunity because I know the Biden administration has given trillions to, you know, different agencies to do more mass transit, think of more transportation opportunities. And I think that would, you know, we need to start looking into different technologies so that way we can move people around. Because remember, population is growing, gas prices are rising, people are going to be using more and more mass transit in the future. And I think we need to start setting that foundation into doing that. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
I just want to comment because I think it's a really good point that she brings up about trying to look at, you know, what we're doing and what technologies are out there. I think what's also important to see is how are we connecting to light rail. I think sometimes we don't have the connections to get people there or to get them back to you know, that first and last mile, they call it. We do have the program through Measure B, but we might be able to find really important projects with the cities or other connections, other corridors that might be really help drive those connections and get people to be able to use public transportation or mass transportation because they know they'll be able to get to their job or to their home or to their appointment.
Yeah, I hear you on that. But, you know, and just a philosophical comment, if we really, I mean, when you think about it, if you really want people to use mass transit, we ought to give them a tax incentive. I mean, you know, that right there is, if people, a tax write-off, that's really another way you can get people to use a mass transit. Anyway, just some food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Liccardo.
Thank you, Chair Jones. Really good questions from my colleagues. I just wanted to follow up on a few of them. Do you have a sense, Carolyn, just on orders of magnitude, what it would cost to move a station, or light rail station, to better, if it's on a line where, as Member Abakoga suggested, that we would move it closer to where the jobs might be, and obviously get much higher ridership that way. Is that a cost on the order of millions, tens of millions? What does that look like?
Well, I have to say, I can tell you in Utah dollars, which is not what it is here, because we did
I'll
that.
take Utah dollars and we can round up.
It was, I would have to say, when we were putting a system, it was roughly, it was somewhere around $10 million to do that. To do that.
So we say 20.
No, I would no. I was going to say it was I think we. No, I have to say it was fairly cheap there because we built a whole station in the middle of our line, and that was roughly about $3 million. But I would say all in costs and everything in Silicon Valley, we're probably looking around 10. But I don't know. Ken Ronci could probably answer that question easier than
that's a good sense in terms of order of magnitude. And then order of magnitude, just what we're spending now to extend the line along East Ridge is somewhere north of 400 million, we think, all in, right?
Yes.
And I'm trying to remember how long that extension is. Is it 2 miles? I'm trying to remember.
It's roughly 2.5 miles, I believe.
2.5. Okay. So we're somewhere on the order of about 150 million a mile there. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And then could you help me understand why we chose cost per hour rather than cost per rider making this presentation?
Sure. Our focus today was really to kind of focus more on the cost side of this. And so we want to essentially not focus on the ridership numbers. As Carolyn mentioned, we have a number of efforts to increase our ridership that are kind of part of this discussion, but not the discussion we want to have today. So we really want to focus purely on the cost parts.
Well, I think what we want to do is have the board knowledgeable about what's driving our own costs internally and what we might be able to take a look at on these systems evaluations. That's where we'll start to look at cost per rider across different things that we could do in ways that we could drive it. So I think once we start getting into the analysis of the system, that's probably where we'll see more, that's where we'll see that. And also we want to take a look at what the cities are doing as well. So that cost per rider, we just wanted the board today to understand sort of efforts that stepping really back and looking at what internally might be driving our costs. And then we also have that ridership piece, and then looking at the overall systems, because that cost per rider is where we're going to make decisions about how long do we run light rail? Do we not run light rail late in, at certain times of the evenings? We run it fairly long right now. Do some markets not need that? Those types of things will make decisions.
And thank you. If we were to go back to that chart where we're comparing ourselves to other cities and agencies on a cost per hour, I'm guessing since we have pretty low ridership, the cost per rider would look even worse. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, that's a fair assumption. There's a lot of different ways to look at these metrics too. I'll just also note that if we looked at, say, cost per mile of service, because we're a faster system, our cost per mile actually looks better than it would on this chart. If we go back a couple more.
No, the chart I'm referring to is the one.
Slide 7, I believe.
Yeah, that's it. Right. So I guess where I'm getting at with this is I appreciate that we're focusing on reducing costs, and we have to take these issues in bite-sized pieces, and there's a lot of smaller questions that have to be asked. But I'm still focused on the bigger question, which is, are we riding the right horse here? and I guess when we think about where the hockey puck is going, and I really agree with Director Hendrick's statement that I think this decision is coming at us much faster than 3 to 7 years. I think if we wait for 7 years, this will be past us because we'll have already had to commit to replacing technology and we're stuck with it. I'm a little concerned that we're not thinking a bit more about how these costs really materialize in the real world. And going back to, the chart that you were just showing and comparing the cost of bus versus light rail. I know that outside of Levi Stadium, an occasional arena event, I don't think any of us have ever seen 120 people on a light rail car before, or set of cars. It just doesn't happen routinely. And so I'm trying to understand if the goal is, if the goal is you're trying to build a system that's future-proof, and you're just anticipating there's going to be lots of jobs around the light rail line, that's one set of assumptions. But I'd imagine a future-proof system would also have to think about the question that Director Abakoga asked and Director Rennie asked, which was, how are we going to get the system to other job centers? And the system we have is really, really expensive to expand. And it's really expensive to be nimble, to try to somehow or another adjust it to where the development is. And certainly the VTA could take a much more aggressive stance on development and tell folks where they should be building so that we can maximize the transit system, but that's not what we've done in the past. And so I'm trying to understand sort of why we're aligning ourselves with a strategy that says, hey, let's just reduce the costs and we'll think about the big question later. I mean, my recollection was, the MTC sent down an edict, I think in 2008, telling all the agencies in the Bay Area, all 29, hey, you guys got to reduce costs. You got to undertake studies. And we all rolled up our sleeves and worked on ways to reduce costs. And theoretically, we've been doing that all along. So I'm trying to understand, if this is something we theoretically have been working on for years and years, why do we think the future is going to be any different if we're still essentially chaining ourselves to this system?
You raise good points, because one of the questions right now is can we get the system in line? And with costs, it help because, as we start to look at, and you'll be having presentations on our, fiscal sustainability, those types of things play into it. I think the reason why we want to understand what we're doing is that is there a way to make this system a little more cost effective, a lot more cost effective, I guess, and not just, just on the ridership, what can we do internally to help support that efforts and also try to bring up the ridership? But I think that question needs to be, we need to really dig deep into the system, what's going on, are there ways to get there before we make the decision to make a wholesale change. There's also technology changes in rail vehicles as well. Like next week, I'll be looking at vehicles that run on battery packs and don't need to be on catenary the entire time. And so you don't have to build catenary, and that you can use, overhead charging stations, and we can look at microgrids that can be supported also with buses. And so there's a lot of new technologies we need to take a look at. And those types of vehicles are going to be, they're already running in Europe, and they're going to start running in this country. So there are things that we could start to look at, as well as other rubber tired vehicles, if that's where we want to go. But I think we need to take a look at what's driving our costs today as part of the system. So I agree. I think you're right. The 3 years, what Board Member Hendrick said is true. It's 3 to 7 years we have to make this decision. We're trying to get 3 to 7 years when we make the decision. So what we want to do is get ourselves as knowledgeable as we can in these next 2 years to start deciding what that decision should be. And a lot of that is going to be where the city's going.
I'm never going to argue against doing analysis. We absolutely need to understand more and do better, but I'm just not satisfied that we're focusing in the right areas that's going to get us the right answers. I mean, for example, this chart was displayed to us, and part of the explanation was, well, we're a really expensive area. Well, San Francisco is every bit as expensive, if not more expensive, in labor costs. And look where they are compared to where we are. There's a lot going on here. And then even if we're at national average, if we did this in a cost per rider, we'd still be at the bottom, even if we got a cost down to the national average. So we can certainly make marginal improvements. And I encourage folks to do all they can to see how we can operate more efficiently. How can we, those are all good questions to ask for a lot of folks, but to bring this question to the board, I think we need to ask bigger questions, because marginal improvements aren't going to change this picture at all. And I guess I'm concerned that we're kind of charting a course that says we're going to be satisfied with marginal improvements. I mean, if we could go for a moment back to that slide that compares the bus and light rail. You know, I mean, first, I think the point's already been made. You know, for the most part, overwhelmingly, our system is running in the first of the four scenarios, right? It's running at 45 passengers per ride, you know, not at 120, 240, or 360. And I appreciate, hey, we all expect more ridership sometime in the future as we all densify and so forth, but that's going to be a long way off, and we can certainly adjust the system if we have a nimble enough system to be able to add buses and so forth. But then when we ask bigger questions like, well, if we know a half dozen cities within the next half decade are likely to be moving toward autonomy, how does that affect these numbers? And I assume that overwhelmingly the bus costs are driven by the labor costs of drivers. You know, I think a really good question was asked about using articulated buses. How do we make buses longer so we can get more riders on each vehicle? Also, obviously, what happens when autonomy comes to every transit system in the country, which it would appear it's going to happen in the next decade. And I know these are really hard conversations, particularly to have with our employees, but we should be having them so that we can assure them first that no one is going to be left out, that they're going to be part of the solution. This isn't going to be a system that we're trying to fire employees or somehow or another replace them with machines, because we know autonomy is going to require a lot of labor also. But we ought to be bringing them into these conversations very early and asking those hard questions and working on with them together so we can co-design something that ensures that everybody stays on board, everybody continues to get paid what they get paid, but we actually have a system that looks a lot different and performs a lot better than the one we got. And I'm guessing if you introduced autonomy here, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but those cost numbers for buses drop dramatically because it's all about the operator costs that so greatly exceed light rails in the yellow bar. Is that right?
Yeah, I'll just note that at that point would be correct, that buses costs would get reduced significantly.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess the bottom line for me is I don't think we're asking big enough questions, and I'm concerned we're not asking the right questions. And yes, I understand there are very large estimates for the capital costs, for example, of converting some of the track to pavement that would be appropriate for buses. But we've got a lot of light rail that runs on pretty much on road today. And not all of that costs an enormous amount to convert. I mean, we could talk about, for example, starting at North San Jose and talking about what bus lines there might look like. I mean, it was a decade and a half ago, we were having this conversation about whether or not we wanted to run light rail down East Santa Clara Street and Alum Rock. And we all agreed, hey, it would be a really bad idea to keep expanding this very expensive system when we know bus rapid transit could provide a better solution and a more nimble one that could help us be future-proof. So if we need to change the routes, we can move the system, better get to where the riders are. And I thought that was the right approach. I'm concerned that we're focusing on the small questions now rather than asking the big ones while we're working on all the other efficiency improvements. So I'll stop talking now. I'm sorry to take up so much time. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Chavez.
Thank you. I wanted to start with one of the last points that Sam raised that I thought was really critical. And that is that, you know, for a long time, at least since I've been on the board, there's been this real reluctance to engage the line staff in discussions about technology and the future of transportation. And I think that, you know, as we start to redevelop the culture of the organization and redevelop our organization overall, that this is a perfect opportunity to, in a deep and meaningful way, engage the line staff in answering all of the questions that have been raised today, everything relative to the as Mayor Liccardo described them, kind of small questions about why X costs more than Y, and what our comparison is to the next organization. But then the bigger picture questions about what are the emerging technologies and what are the opportunities that get created that are healthful for the organization and for our writers. So one request that I would make is that the board get an off-agenda report on how the line staff employees are going to be integrated into the next phase of work, how they've been integrated, and how they will be integrated into the next phase of work. So that's one request. And Carolyn, I'll look to you to see what your thinking is on that.
Well, I agree. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, will say that I did talk to John Courtney before this meeting, just to let him know and where we're going, and that we'd like, to do some of the, to move forward on some of these analysis, we will need to work closely with ATU, and we'll have to do it with some of the other unions and the labor. One of the things for example, they're participating in the Parks Task Force. They're part of that task force that Austin Jenkins
That's
put
great.
together.
So
and that's been great. So we'll bring forward more concrete definition of how that will happen.
Great. And so the point you're raising is that since you've been here, you're starting in that direction, that this is a direction that you want to go in, and that you'll give us an off agenda or the most appropriate way to report the inclusion of line staff in answering all of these questions.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
And then I want to toggle between kind of the big picture and the kind of what we see on the ground. I think we just need to say to all of our colleagues is that, one of the challenges that we have with buses is that buses are on the same routes as cars. And so when we're looking at speed and we're looking at capacity, that we have many different opinions about bus rapid transit, as an example, up and down the main spine of our transit program, that I do think that whatever the benchmarks are for what we want to invest in, that ridership and speed have to be key components of that. Otherwise, we're sort of trading off one, frankly, not to move faster than the other. So I think that's really important. And one thing I would say to our team is that I think it's really important to be able to do these kinds of comparisons. But when you look at capacity, we are also really driven, and it's hard to do this post 2020, but we're really driven to look at where we see the most opportunity for the increase in utilization, right? Like, where can we get more passengers? And because the capacity sort of it's a real metric, but it doesn't mean that that's the utilization. And Mayor Liccardo was making that point about light rail. I would make that point about buses as well. So we need to think about all that, and also to recognize that in some instances we've been looking at smaller buses because we are taking these neighborhood routes, and as we're restructuring our system, we are looking at different tools. So I think that whatever charts we show, we're going to have to figure out a way to include utilization as a key component of where we want to be and where we want to get to. The other thing I am really interested in, again, this is kind of to toggle between the big picture and the smaller picture. I really want to make sure that as the Diridon station is being built out, that light rail, its properties through that property, whether it's light rail today or some future technology, it has to be prioritized. And I have yet to see a report come back to the board that says, here's what we're doing there. And here's why, even though Diridon's moving forward, we're not missing an opportunity. And the reason is that the board not just me, but other board members have raised this over the last 4 years. And I still haven't seen a document that says, here's the options that we're looking at as it relates to Deer Station and light rail. And I don't know if something like that exists now or where that is in process.
I think on that last point, I'll just note that the Diridon Light Rail Station will most likely be part of that downtown light rail study that we're moving forward with. So it'll incorporate a lot of those thoughts. So we are thinking about that moving forward.
Well, I think, Jason, the problem I have is that we have been thinking about that for a while and the planning is happening. So what I would like to recommend is that if we're serious about seeing whether or not this is an opportunity, which I think it is, I think we need to formally VTA, make that a formal action so that that is currently being discussed, because right now that is going to be laid out without it. And, you know, there, to be honest with you, this goes in the category of no excuses, right? That's going to be done. And we're going to say, oh, we have an idea about light rail. And, you know, that's just going to be really wrong on a lot of levels. So I would just ask if we need to bring this back to the board as a referral. I'm happy to do that. If the staff is going to be prepared to do that, fine. But I think that needs to formally go from VTA to the other partners, asking for consideration for routes through the through that station, or utilization through that station. I don't know what the best next step is on that.
I'll take a look at that. You know, that's a good point. I know there has been a lot of discussion about, you know, pulling it to be on the other side of the station. And I think that's something we want to look at. There's also been talking about different, you know, strong connections into that and in the future. So look, I think we might need to speed that up ahead of time. I agree.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think this reflects back on the point that Supervisor Lee raised about, you know, how silly are we going to look if we miss an opportunity? I mean, he was talking about that in terms of grade steps, but I just think, you know, we should dive in there and make our needs met or known. And then the last point I wanted to raise is that, you know, I think the point, Carolyn, that you talked about relative to technology availability and what we anticipate seeing in the future is an interesting point. And I think this was Mayor Liccardo who made mention of this a few meetings ago, that we want to make sure that we're looking at emerging technology that's viable and real. And what is of concern to me, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this, is what's happening around the globe relative to this kind of rail product. And I think it's it is a rail product in between, you know, heavy, light, medium light. And I know that different states have even different rules about, you know, what they call light rail. So that is a long way of saying that I think that as emerging technologies become available, that we should make sure that we have one of the board's committees that at least is getting updated on what we see, so that folks can start to understand how the decisions we're making in the interim, and I think this is another point that Mayor Liccardo raised, impact long-term, and where there may be opportunities to pivot that we don't see today. And so I know we have a, you know, whatever the capital committee is, makes sense to have those discussions. And again, I'm assuming all of this will be happening with our workforce. And but I think there's a lot of value in knowing what really is coming down the pike and what isn't available. And colleagues, we had a discussion yesterday about our paratransit vehicles. And, you know, I was surprised to learn yesterday that there are no electric versions of the vehicles that we're using. And we've all been trying to go, you know, green. And we're buying new vehicles that are not green because there's no green vehicles available. And so I think those discussions are just really critical to have with the board, so the board's really aware of what the opportunities are. And colleagues, thank you for indulging me.
Thank you. Director Liccardo.
Thanks. I just appreciate comments to Supervisor Chavez. I just wanted to clarify something about the buses. I'm not suggesting we would simply supplant light rail with buses running with traffic. I think the two great assets that VTA here has are first a great workforce and exclusive right of way. And all that exclusive right of way is moving people. And the question is, can we use that exclusive right of way and deploy our great workforce to move people differently? And if the buses aren't exclusive right of way, they're going to be moving very, very fast. They're going to be out of traffic. And frankly, it's the exclusive right of way that we can make happen much more nimbly if we're trying to get to other job centers throughout the valley. To address the questions of several, directors raised, how do we get this light rail to more places? It's not going to happen nimbly with the current system we have, because we've been at Eastridge for 20 years and it's not under construction yet. And it's costing a lot of money. So I just think we need to think about how we create a system that is future-proof, which means we can be more nimble in the routes and we can move people much more effectively. And that's all emerging. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to follow up, if I can, through the chair, I think, Sam, you and I are in agreement on that. I think what I'm concerned about is just the way the charts look for the public, but thank you.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. Fair point.
Thank you, Director Ng.
Is that me, Lee Ng?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Chair. Sorry about that. I appreciate the comments that were made before me, and I appreciate that there's going to be a cost task force, but I really want to be sure that the cost task force is realistic in what we can do to modify existing rails, because earlier in the report, it talked about if we needed to fill in the current system, how much it costs to recoup and having it become bus lines again, it would take 60 years to recoup. But we also have to be realistic on costs. I'm concerned about the estimates that we will be given. I think we should look at other states that have implemented systems that the costs went way out of line, such as the Hawaii rail system. What once was costing 400 million is now 4 to 12 billion. So I think we really need to get clear estimates and clear options, and the estimates of these options before us. And I think what happens is, if it takes a long time to implement as well, that system in itself might become antiquated. And like Mayor Liccardo said, our goal is to ensure that these projects become future-proof, and we have to really understand the timeline in which we are expecting this system to be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Paul?
Thanks, Chair. So I just wanted to briefly say that I think this is a great and important discussion, and I agree with all the sentiments that have been shared here. I think we need to go ahead and future-proof this system, build out a system that's effective, make it as fast as possible. I know it's not going to be easy or cheap, but we can do the work to try to figure out, perhaps starting with Dearborn Station, what our transit centers are going to look like, not just in the central node, but in the other areas. And one thing I wanted to point out with regard to technology, if we're worried about kind of replacing what's there right now with light rail, we should be looking at our opportunities. We should be looking at the Stevens Creek corridor and thinking a bit more ambitiously. I don't know if we're talking about elevated or underground, or whether we're using, electromagnet technology or other, forms of, low resistance, thereby saving energy costs and whatnot. But I think we need to look at those opportunities and, keep an eye on those if we're really serious about, looking at the future and technology. And I'll also just put in a plug for the 85 corridor and the Measure B money for the $350 million. I think we should be very serious about that as well, because that's a significant component of potential transit. And that was, a longstanding promise. And, people know that the West Valley's median of 85, it's supposed to be for transit. And we should be looking at those opportunities. We don't, if we don't need to step on toes and we don't need to alienate people in terms of, the sense of disenfranchisement or, financial opportunity, then let's look to the future and make sure that we're, kind of planning out those transitions. So I really don't have, more to add to this really great discussion. I mean, honestly, I think this is the best discussion I've heard in my brief time here. But it's so critically important to the future of our area. And of course, it doesn't just implicate the transit system, it implicates a lot of other issues, right? In terms of like, how do we get from point A to B quickly? Get availability of different spaces for people who need those opportunities. So thanks.
Thank you. Director Liccardo, you still have your hand up. I don't know if you wanted to speak again or. Okay, we're gonna move on. Next is item 2.2, an update on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission's Network Manager Business Case. Scott Haywood, Deputy Director, Transit Planning and Capital Development, will provide a presentation on this item.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. If we go to the first slide, please. Great. The purpose of this item today is to provide the board with an update and to receive any feedback on MTC's efforts to analyze a transit network management arrangement. The idea for the transit network manager came from the Commission's Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force and is an effort to better coordinate regional services with transit agencies and ultimately improve the experience for the rider. I last gave an update to the board about a year ago, and since that time, MTC has conducted some preliminary work on the transit network management idea. The MTC is now entering a new phase where they will conduct an analysis to evaluate the benefits, the costs, and risks of several alternatives. Additionally, the transit operators have been working on this issue and have developed a proposal for a transit network management executive board, which we will also be sharing with you today. If we go to the next slide too, please. Thanks, I'm sorry about that we're there. The Transit Network Management Executive Board will be among the alternatives that MTC and their team will be analyzing. To make our presentation today, we have Rick Ramis here. Up until recently, Rick was the general manager for County Connection. And in addition to being the GM at County Connection for the last 24 years, Rick is also the immediate past chair of the Clipper Executive Board, the MTC Partnership Board, and the California Transit Association State Legislative Committee. Rick is working with the transit agencies to serve as our technical advisor and to represent the transit agencies on this issue. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rick to give the presentation. Rick?
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board for allowing me to be here today to talk briefly about what is going on, particularly as the general managers across the region engage with MTC and other stakeholders on what is called the network management business case analysis. And as Scott mentioned, coming out of the Blue Ribbon Task Force, this advisory group was set up by MTC that I'll touch on in a minute. And it's going to be looking at alternatives that originally were submitted last summer. The operators submitted one through the general managers. The stakeholders of various stakeholders have submitted a proposal. And of course, MTC staff have been working on their own ideas. The key here, I think right now, is the executive director of MTC, Teresa McMillan, in a conversation with me last week, refers to these as what's the word she used? I'm losing my train of thought here. She called them models. She's not wanting to look at these as competing proposals, but rather three models that deserve equal comparison and consideration on a level playing field. And I'm encouraged by that on behalf of the general managers that Therese sees it as that. And so what I'm going to talk about next is go over a few slides about a piece of the operator's model, particularly as it relates to the network management board. Next slide, please. So the advisory group is made up of 14 members appointed by MTC, 7 transit general managers, including your own Carolyn Gannott, the MTC director, and 6 key stakeholders. For example, SPIRT is a member, as is Seamless Bay Area, as is labor, I believe represented by the ATU regional business agent. This group is going to receive recommendations from a consultant. The consultant is going to be interacting with various folks, including the operators, to develop these recommendations over the next several months. And then we'll provide periodic updates to the commission and final recommendations slated for a possible action by the commission in September. Next slide. I think this is critical. The operators working together, and this really builds upon 2 years of close coordination amongst the operators at the general manager level and at the senior staff level, have come up with a mission statement for the Transit Network Management Executive Board to be considered in this examination by the consultants. And the mission statement is as follows: act as a centralized forum and coordinating body for regional transit policy development and network management to improve customer experience, advance equity, and increase transit ridership. What I really like about this mission statement is it's the general managers acknowledging the need for the operators to work together amongst themselves and with MTC to really focus on improving the customer experience. And I think that's really critical, given your previous discussion you had this morning about how to make your system more effective and gain more riders. I think attacking it from a customer perspective is really the way to go and going to be very helpful on a lot of these issues. So I like the mission statement, and I hope it receives good consideration at the commission, and that I think is part of my task. Next slide, please. Also, the operators have given a lot of thought on some objectives that the board ought to have to provide structured coordination on regional transit planning. That is really happening today already. The operators meet every Monday. The large properties, all the GMs and COs meet every Monday. And on Tuesday afternoon, all the smaller operators that are largely in the east and northern suburban areas meet once a week. Together, they have talked about how to help MTC implement its transformation action plan. As you may be aware of, they adopted this last fall at a workshop, I believe. There's 27 items in that action plan. It's very ambitious, but I think those items are crucial to making transit more effective in the Bay Area over time. And also to attack some immediate things that can be done. The Network Management Board can help with ongoing efforts that have already started in the area of fare integration work that's underway, as well as wayfinding to help the customer understand how to navigate these various systems, as well as help with transit priority. Again, a nod back to your last discussion, how to make buses faster on roadways where they share that road with the car. Next slide, please. Also, baked in the operator's model is the board structure. And the operator GMs are calling for a board that takes advantage of the expertise that's around the region with the various transit operator general managers and MTC senior staff, and also bringing along riders and stakeholders who have a lot of knowledge about what the customer needs, boots on the ground, if you will. It would leverage existing governance structures and authorities and accountabilities. What's critical about that is if you do that, you can advance work immediately. You don't have to rebuild governance structures, which could take many years. It's a complicated subject to kind of rebuild those governance structures. So how can you leverage the existing ones and move forward? And that's what the operators are trying to put forward. Next slide, please. And so that goes to decision making. And the general managers are calling for a network management board that would allow the existing transit boards to retain their authorities. It would be consensus based, but there'd be a majority executive vote when needed. Decisions would advance to MTC or the transit agency boards as appropriate, depending on the item and what's inside the item. MTC in particular would maintain its role in regional policy and funding under this recommendation. And then the agency boards, of course, need to maintain their authorities relative to fares because they're held accountable. And in some cases under law, they're held accountable for that. And it impacts your budgets as well as how you allocate your funds. Relative to your local service needs as you see fit, that needs to continue. Next slide. And so finally here, the proposal calls for a board collaborative process and it lays the groundwork with the existing bodies. It incorporates technical expertise through the general managers and the senior staff that already meet an array of weekly committee meetings. It seeks to engage diverse perspectives, and it calls for an advisory council to be formed that's formal and provides a meaningful and meaty venue for stakeholder participation to advise on key issues and concerns, et cetera, that would fall under the network management process. And I think at this point I have one more slide I'd like to touch on, yes. So I mentioned this briefly just a minute ago. There are already a number of working groups, subcommittees, operator groups, et cetera, that are working weekly in addition to these general managers that feed the general managers meeting and then feed the collaborative process that already exists between MTC and the operators and has been strengthened greatly over the last 2 years. The proposal from the operators, as do all the other models or proposals, call for the creation of additional groups that are formalized and established as needed to work on the various issues that might fall under the network management board. And the operators are calling for public transparency and regular reporting, including to MTC, and regular public meetings that would be noticed and public would be invited to participate fully. And I think with that, Scott, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Sure, thanks very much, Rick. I just wanted to touch on the next steps a little bit, that through April, MTC and their consultant will be working on the scoping, doing existing conditions and the alternative, or I guess now model refinement, as Rick just described. They'll then do the analysis that's going to go through July, and then they hope to have some recommendations by August and September. So a very aggressive schedule, and we'll be working with them on that. I'd like to just conclude with a couple of additional comments. First of all, I think it's important to note that VTA is a single agency and that we do cover 25% of the Bay Area's population. The vast majority of trips made in Santa Clara County both begin and end within our county. And in fact, pre-pandemic, nearly 88% of all Santa Clara County commuters began and ended their commute right within Santa Clara County. So the good news is that for most riders, they don't need to transfer to another system, as we are one agency here in this county. So local trips are clearly our bread and butter. However, regional trips are also very important, and we have consistently demonstrated our commitment to regional services through our support of BART, Caltrain, and ACE, as well as other regional services such as Dumbarton Express and Highway 17 Express as well. The second item I just want to mention is that MTC is committed to funding these regional efforts Rick just described. As MTC was going through their allocation process for the COVID relief funds, they set aside $85 million to help with the Transformation Action Plan, as well as the regional transit network efforts. So just in conclusion, I would like to once again mention that the purpose of this meeting today is, first off, to provide an update from my last presentation about a year ago. And it's also to receive your feedback. Specifically, we'd like to hear your reactions to the idea of a regional transit network manager as a general concept. And then we'd also like to get your reactions to the operator's proposal that we've just outlined. Finally, we'd like to hear if you would prefer that the network manager not be focused by the transit operators, but be by another agency, and how comfortable you would be in giving some authority to a new regional agency or MTC, even if that means giving up some local control. So with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions, and we look forward to receiving any feedback that you might have. I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Scott and Rick. We will now take public comments. Rennie, do we have any hands raised?
Yes, we actually do have a couple. And for the record, I want to note that the Seamless Bay Area, Silicon Valley Independent Living, and Friends of Caltrain have submitted their public comment and are already posted online. Also, Mr. Blair's, which was received earlier this morning, will be posted after the workshop. Calling on Ms. Adina, you may begin speaking when you're ready.
Good morning, board members. My name is Adina Levin, and I serve on the advisory body for this study in my role on the Policy Advisory Council, as well as Seamless Bay Area. And I would somewhat dismayed to see this presentation to the board. So I'm glad to hear about the importance of the Transformation Action Plan for VTA and the discussion about the importance of connections in the previous presentation about ridership. However, this presentation today talked about a study that will be looking at multiple options, and the study has only presented to this board only one option. Last week, members of BART and AC Transit boards asked to see all of the options before weighing in, and I would urge you to ask to see all of the options before expressing an opinion. Thank you.
Next speaker, Eugene, you may begin speaking when you're ready. Eugene? I will come back to you, Mr. Beekman. Please unmute and begin speaking.
Hi, Blair Beekman here. To speak really quickly, I'm interested in the work, how we can, what we can do now to make more open and clear how the future of high-speed rail can be a benefit and connect itself to all Bay Area cities and counties at this time. And as we prepare for the year 2023 and 24 in the SF Bay Area, it is open, honest, and accountable planning and business practices that can make it easier to create open and honest dialogue and can help set important goals of community public health, safety, friendship, and care that needs to be considered in the next few years. Good luck how we can talk about openness and accountability for all of us. It can build positive good practices. Thank you.
Thank you. Eugene, please unmute and begin speaking.
Morning,
Eugene?
board member. Yes, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
This is Eugene Bradley, founder and CEO of Silicon Valley Transit Users. I echo Ms. Levin's comments regarding the fact that only one such option has been presented by staff to the board. Earlier, you noticed talk amongst the board members about how limiting some of the options are. This is why things are the way they are now, because we're only presented with at most one option to doing anything, and it's usually not always the best option. See BART, see Alum Lock, BRT lanes. We need to better have all the options that are available, because if we want to have better connections for passengers, especially intra and inter-agency, we have to change things. I know it's not comfortable. Change is always necessary, because a system that doesn't change is a dying system. And right now, I'm seeing a Bay Area transit agency system that's slowing dying. We got to change it. So ask for all options and then make a decision. Thank you.
That's the last speaker we have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We will now close public comment. Are there any questions from my colleagues? I see Director Perales.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the presentation and update on this. I've been very interested in this work as it has progressed, and I absolutely am supportive of having a better integrated system regionally, and even if that means locally, each agency having to give up some local authority, but being able to just work more collaboratively as a region. We know so many of our riders are not confined to one system or one segment of our region, and really navigating and hopping in between different providers is proven challenging, and I know I've done so myself, traversing just the Bay Area, and so I'm very supportive of it. But I too am concerned, because I have not been intimately involved as some of the others that have on the work and the recommendations. I do recognize that we are getting a preferred option or preferred alternative here, and wanted to see, similarly to the public comment and some of the other agencies, about a comparison and where our board will have an opportunity to weigh out what the other options were and be able to provide some feedback versus just simply have a comment on this one preferred alternative. Wanted to see if staff could respond to that. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you much, Member Perales. Yeah, I mean, we certainly can do that. We wanted to make sure that we got the Transit Network Manager Executive Board to everyone on our board, since this is something that we as staff have been working on with the transit agencies for a long time. So we wanted to, and if this were to be implemented, it would certainly change the way we do business a bit as well. So we wanted to make sure that we get that out to our board, and that's what most of the transit agencies in the area are doing. As we move forward and as MTC begins doing some of their analysis, we could certainly bring that back to this board or committee, whatever would work best, and talk about how they're progressing. And as they do the analysis, bring it up to this board. Just want to note too, we really are, there's no decision being made. We're not asking you to recommend it or anything like that today. Really just we're hoping to get some impressions on it and feedback you have. And we can certainly bring you more involved though as MTC moves through this analysis, and you can see all the alternatives and how they're being looked and how they compare to the criteria that's been developed.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think feedback in this, I think is positive, but I also think that allowing the board to have some feedback on what some of the other alternatives would be positive as well. I think, as I've mentioned, I do appreciate this, and I do think this is the direction we need to go. And so I think we're moving in the right direction, but certainly I know that there have been some other alternatives not only discussed through this process, but also there are other alternatives that we can look to around the country and around the world, actually, in regards to how different agencies in one region can work better together in different models. And so, look forward to staff continuing to, I think, monitor and then update the board on what those options are. But overall, again, thank you for the presentation and certainly appreciating the direction we're going. That's it. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Director Chavez.
Thank you. Just a couple of things. First, I wanted to say to the staff, thank you, and thank you for thinking about the alternatives. I will say, as a member of the MTC board, I have not felt that we have necessarily seen alternatives to the presentations that have been given to the board, meaning that I think that the Blue Ribbon Commission has a pretty strong sense of the way it wants to proceed. And so I think better understanding, understanding all the options are important. And I do agree with my colleagues. I think being able to compare those options and the pros and cons of them for each of our entities is really important. That said, just a couple of questions about the model that you're proposing. Could you, and I'm not sure who the right person to ask is, but could one of you just describe the biggest difference between what you're presenting to us and what the Blue Ribbon Commission is presenting to our board?
Sure, maybe I'll take a crack at it. And Rick, if you want to jump in at any time. The main difference would be this would not be the network executive board that we're proposing would be essentially run by the transit operators. They would meet formally together, but that would be the entity that would make decisions and would work to integrate the things we want to integrate at the regional level. So that's where the group would be. It would be that group would look at different things. The GMs of the transit operators, they would then make recommendations and they would then come back to their own boards. And in some cases, it would be things that they could just decide together. Underneath the network manager idea that MTC and some others have looked at, that would be a new body that would therefore debate those issues, look at those issues, how we could better integrate. And then they would pass those recommendations down, or depending on how it went, they wouldn't be recommendations. They could even be requirements down to the transit agencies then to put together. Rick, would you have anything to add to that?
No, Scott, I think you described that pretty well. I think the key distinction is in the model being put forward by the general managers. It still has the transit operators working together and perhaps required to work together to generate the things that then move on to MTC and the operators. Whereas some of the other approaches might be they're developed in a new arena, whether it's an MTC or a standalone body, and then given to the operators, even though there might be operator participation in that development. All the models assume the operators are involved in the processing and development of what comes out of network management. But I think the key difference is the starting point and who's generating the ideas versus responding to them.
And Rick, can you explain a little bit the similarities it is to the Clipper board? Because we have a Clipper executive board right now that's with the transit operators. It's not with MTC. There was a decision after the beginning aspects of Clipper to move it to a group with the general managers are participating in.
Sure, and if I may, I will throw out a second comparison real quickly. So the Clipper Executive Board was born out of a somewhat similar set of circumstances, only focused only on payments and having a regional ticket. And that is the general managers came together with the executive director of MTC and hashed out how to form the Clipper Executive Board and develop its charter and its way of operation and then the MOUs between the operators and MTC. And so with everything Clipper, it goes to the Clipper Executive Board. And once the Clipper Executive Board has done something with it, it goes to MTC. And that's a two-step process. The other thing that has happened recently is the Fair Integration Study, which is co-managed by MTC and BART on behalf of everybody. And they have managed the consultants, they have directed the work, they have reported back to a fair integration task force that is made up of a representative folks from around the region. And that has worked very well in getting forward now a set of recommendations on fair integration to be further delved into to see about how quickly it can be implemented and what are some of the issues that have to be overcome to implement the recommendations. So those are two things that I think the operator general managers as a whole think very well of and are similar to what the operators have put forward to be looked at by the consultant at MTC that MTC has retained for the work over this spring and summer.
Colleagues, I think a couple things that I just want to reinforce. One is that, as we think about the partnership we have with MTC, and I think the importance of what the community stepped up and talked a lot about is how do we have, a seamless experience for people on the ground. And I think that's really critical. I also think that we need to be mindful of the investments that we're as a region making and what investments should be coming to each community, and then how those investments are, for lack of a better word, sort of redistributed. And so as an example, I want to go back to one point that Scott raised about Santa Clara County being 25% of the population. But if you look at MTC's both governance and the way resources are spent, we've had a very difficult time getting money back to the county. Now, I just want to say as a region, I recognize that that's not all, that in many instances, being able to share assets and resources makes a lot of sense. But when it is being done to us and not necessarily with us is when I have a concern. And it does feel to me like the direction that MTC is going in right now is that would be a bigger barrier for us as a region, as a South Bay region than perhaps it is today. And part of the reason I'm excited that the general managers are coming up with an alternative is that everybody, and I think in the spirit of collaboration, have really been working with the Blue Ribbon Commission to try to get these new structures of governance thought through. That said, I don't know that everybody spoke up, and they should have. And so I really want to appreciate that having an alternative, I think, means that we're either going to have an option that can be utilized or one that will influence that which finally gets across the finish line. So thank you, Carolyn, and to Rick and others for really diving in and doing that work. The other thing I'll just mention, colleagues, is that we had to work really hard through, I think through Senator Bell, and Mayor Liccardo can remind us of this, even to get a seat on the board for Mayor Liccardo, because and And even with that, they added more seats to other folks so that it's not represented by population, the board of MTC, and there's no, I mean, frankly, if we were going to look at governance, we probably should have looked at that board prior to even coming up with this network manager approach. All that said, I do want to make one point as it relates to MTC and as it relates to the general manager there. I really do believe that their intent and the Blue Ribbon Commission's intent is to do a better job of serving the public. The real question is, what's the best tool to do that? And how do we make sure that as we're really trying to be part of the solution, meaning the South Bay really improving transit ridership and improving access, how are we participating in a way that allows us both to serve our customers, to be accountable to the voters here because we're a self-help county, which is really important, and then also to be part of this integrated regional approach. And I think those are the tools, I mean, the benchmarks I'm using to measure whether or not I think what MTC is trying to do makes sense for the region. So anyway, thanks staff, and thank you colleagues.
Thank you, Director Hendricks.
Yeah, thank you. So as I look at this, there's two pieces of this network manager. One is that there's going to be this new thing that exists and it's going to do something. And the second question is how we go about structuring and what it's going to look like. And I want to leave the second question alone and go back to the first part. There's this new network manager. And can anybody try and explain to me what would be the practical implication or change to VTA? And Scott, maybe you partially said this and said it's going to make decisions on integration and possibly even issue directives that we need to do. So, but I'm just trying to understand if there's something overall of this, how does our life change?
That's a terrific question. I think it could change in a lot of different ways. As I mentioned, there's going to be probably funding that's going to be associated to this. If, for instance, the region or the network manager should tend to emphasize maybe a transfer up in an area. We might be required, for instance, to run more transit service to better connect rather than have the opportunity to put the transit service where we might think it might belong. This is just a hypothetical, but it would be those type of situations, I think, where it would be, they would be saying, here's how we think we can work better as a region for regional passengers. And then we might have to follow suit with our financial decisions where we go. It might also be things such as different types of signages, or even it could impact our fares too. For instance, if one of the things does become to integrate fares in a certain way, that would be something where our board would no longer have the authority to set our own fares, but that would be something that this other regional body might do, and then we would have to react. There could be financial implications on it, maybe or maybe not. So those would just be some hypothetical ways I could see it might change, but I'd be happy to see if Carolyn or Rick has any thoughts on that too.
So yeah, well, not to belabor the point, but I mean, those are the kind of things I think we really need to try and understand. I mean, already at a regional level, we've changed our whole service hour structure to try and to align better with BART as it comes down into our county. I mean, we're already trying to do those things, and with the whole fare integration thing, I think the big piece has always been, does Santa Clara County money stay in Santa Clara County? Does San Mateo money stay in San Mateo? And all of those kind of things. And, so I'm looking for more clarity on what those practical things would be to us, because that's what's going to, make a difference of how I can support this. And, if that's a really good question that I should ask, I would really hope in future presentations, that's like one of the questions that get answered first. Because the other piece of what I wanted to ask about this is, what is the definition of success? I hear generic terms of we want better fare integration and we want more service and, and better wayfaring. But is anybody looking at that if when this is implemented, 10 years after it's done, how do we know it did a good thing? Is anybody looking at that?
I think it's still, it's still kind of early in the process for what they think it's going to be. I mean, I think we've been kind of saying that too, and I think different counties might have different definitions of what success might look like for their passengers and for their citizens. So I think that's something that is going to have to be worked out if this does move forward, because I think what success might mean for us might look different than what it might mean in other parts of the county.
Yeah, I would just suggest, I would think rather than saying we're going to do it and then we'll define success criteria, because that's going to, whoever the biggest fish in the pond is, they're going to define success for them. It might be better if we're able to better define, and maybe not completely, of what is success. So maybe that could help define what it is you want it to be. I just, so that's where I'm at. I mean, you were asked a question of here, do I think the network manager is a good idea, bad idea? It's hard for me to say right now without being able to have a better understanding of what the practical implications to us are, what the definitions of success. And then I think, Supervisor Chavez was just talking about, well, how do we deal with governance and representation? And then the last piece of it is, I would love to see a better description of roles and responsibilities. And how much, how much, I don't want to get into the local control discussion, but how much authority and responsibility will the network manager have in being able to direct something to the different agencies, and what is their accountability to that working or not working? So, I mean, those are the details I'd love to be able to understand more of. I understand we might not be there to have it all yet, but it seems to me those things should be worked on sooner rather than later. And I hope that all made sense.
It does make sense. Oh, go ahead, Carolyn.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense, and it is different because how people measure success is differently. And Rick can speak to this well. I mean, there's 25, 26 operators in the Bay Area. We're very lucky in our county that we're just one large operator. But so the question for us, successes might not be where we are. The other question is the funding. How does the funding get allocated? The first 85 million is coming out of the COVID relief funds. And so that's sort of new money, but is that going to contain? And that's something we need to worry about. We also don't want, because we're one large agency, a lot of our trips stay internal. We support regional travel, but at the same time, we don't want to take resources away for those really important local trips, which is oftentimes where the essential, those who need transit take the most. And so there's a whole focus for us that we're really engaged in. I think as transit operators, I think that was part of the proposal, was to have those discussions, and we're very respectful of what each of us has to do to run our agencies and understand those complications that come with it, and our boards and our funding resources and everything. And so I think that's one of the main reasons why we have been working very hard towards a description, wanting to coordinate together. We do see those efforts, but we just don't know how to, the problem is that how do we, what should that structure be, since this is now placed into this discussion about having an overall network manager?
And again, I think one of the first success criteria is the long-term operational funding components of what this means, and not being given unfunded mandates of how things go and stuff. So you got my points. I think that's, I'm not opposed. It seems to me there's a lot of these critical things that need to be up front in the discussion and not on the backside, because then it's going to be too late to do that. So I'll stop there, but thanks very much. It's a really interesting discussion.
Thank you, Director Abikoga.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for this presentation. I've been on MTC for the last year. I have some knowledge or understanding of this, but I guess I'll start with questions. Given that the study is, I think, concluding in the next few months, can I just ask what brought the GMs to bring out this preferred alternative now? And then second question to that is, what criteria did you use to come up with this preferred alternative?
Sure, maybe I'll start, and if Carolyn or Rick want to jump in, please do. So this alternative, last year, when MTC began kind of moving into this direction, we did have this idea at the same time. So it was a transit network executive board, but it wasn't very, we hadn't spent as much time on it as we would have liked. So what did happen last year is MTC did some high level analysis. And after that, we took our proposal and worked on it a bit more. And it's kind of to a point now that we think it's time to release it. And it does work out well because MTC is starting their second phase of analysis. So this is their base case is really their second phase, which is just beginning right now. So what we looked at in terms of criteria for how we were putting this together is how could we really use the technical expertise of our own staffs and use the experience that each of us has? Because as I mentioned, being one large agency is much different than having three smaller agencies within a county or something like that. So we really thought that relying on each operator's expertise of how to deliver service would really be beneficial for moving a network management idea forward, that the agencies that are actually the ones putting the service on the streets should have should be the ones essentially working and together to get this done. We are very supportive of the ideas too, that we should be working as closely as we can as regional, as transit agencies, that what we can do to better serve the customer. That's something that we all want to do. And since the pandemic, as I think Rick mentioned that the transit GMs meet once a week, to better coordinate. And that's something that's really great. So it's really a way of formalizing this and building on what it is we've already put together.
Rick, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was there at the beginning of MTC putting together the Blue Ribbon Task Force. And right from the start, one of the things that MTC wanted to get at with the Blue Ribbon Task Force was this concept of network management and this concept of governance and how it might be attacked through the Blue Ribbon Task Force. And the Blue Ribbon Task Force had a very ambitious and full agenda and a fairly short time frame of which to get their work done. And they spent, for example, the first third of their time wrestling with how transit was responding to the initial stages of the pandemic. And those, you may all recall that in early days in 2020, March, April, May, June, the transit operators were scrambling to maintain services, to deal with the sudden changes that COVID brought upon us. Some operators struggled to get PPE, just find it from suppliers in the early days, all those kinds of things. And so the Blue Ribbon Task Force took a focus on that, in part at the urging of members of the public who showed up at the Blue Ribbon Task Force and said, this has to be a part of your work. Then as the first wave of the pandemic began to subside through the summer and fall of 2020, they returned their attention towards these issues, including network management. And the operators began to talk about it regularly in anticipation of where we're going now, and knew that if this is going to have a chance of having success, if we're going to help define what success looks like, as has been mentioned, the operators have to use their technical expertise to work together to help guide this and help provide this input. So when this thing does get to the end, we have hopefully a good result that is implementable, that respects the fact that there's 27 operators with independent boards, and each county has different kinds of funding. Santa Clara is a self-help county. So is Contra Costa, where I worked for the last 24 years. And Contra Costa is having similar discussions. How is this all going to interact with our local funding versus what's considered regional? I know Commissioner Wirth and I have discussed this a dozen times, and I continue to be available to her as a Contra Costa commissioner. So there's a lot of similar issues being discussed in that county, as we've heard today here in Santa Clara. So it's been evolving, and I think it will continue to evolve. And I think there is a lot of momentum behind the idea of having some sort of network management to help the region have a better regional system and to hold each other accountable. And at the same time, I think the overall goal for most of the participants is to respect the fact that there's these individual agencies with fiduciary responsibilities to taxpayers.
Thank you so much for reminding me of the genesis of all of this and the evolution of like the Blue Ribbon Task Force's work. And now it's actually kind of the pieces are coming together again. And so just some comments. I do appreciate staff bringing this forward now. It's something that's talked about like constantly at MTC, but I had been concerned that our local agencies and our local boards, VTA board, may not be as aware of what's going on. And so thank you for bringing this forward. And I do appreciate the GM's proposal. I've seen in my short time on MTC that sometimes we don't hear from everyone. There are more vocal voices than others, and then I find out later that what we're being told is not necessarily the sentiment of our transit agencies. So I think it's really important that we do hear from the operators, because they're frankly the ones who are implementing and putting these strategies into place. And I think what I definitely agree with Director Chavez's comments, and she says it much more eloquently than I do. But what I've gathered, I guess, over my short time, is that the challenge here is, and it's been brought up, is that I think we're trying to do a one-size-fits-all approach, but the reality is we are not a one-size-fits-all Bay Area. And 27 agencies is a lot. And coming in, I thought, yes, why can't we just consolidate? But every time I ask about a certain agency and, why don't you consolidate with this other one? Like for me, I was thinking and talking to another transit operator in a different region or city, city, county, San Francisco. What if every, county went down to one agency, kind of like VTA? That would cut down quite a bit. But then, I hear from that region why they can't do that. And so it's really not that easy as it might seem. But what I definitely appreciate, and I think we all are in agreement that we do want to serve our riders, serve our public the best we can, do it in as seamless a way as possible. And so, I appreciate that we are looking into this carefully. I think some of the concerns that I may have heard, and I think they're being addressed perhaps is one, the issue of public input. And my assumption, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but as you've been meeting through COVID, it's been just the GM, so it's not a public process at this point. So I think I heard that moving forward, you would consider that, and hopefully that would alleviate some of the concerns that at least I've been hearing from the public. But my biggest issue here, and I appreciate Director Hendrick's comments, is that there is I think there's some trade-offs that we have to consider, mainly in regards to funding. So as Director Chavez mentioned, we still have to work on making sure that we in the South Bay are getting our fair share of funding. And like we have that battle constantly, frankly, at the MTC level. My concern moving forward as we look at the network manager approach versus the preferred alternative, the GMs, is that where will the funding come from it if we were to go the network manager model? As mentioned, we've put in, I believe, $85 million into the Blue Ribbon Task Force initiatives, but some of that funding came from ARPA money. And I think you all know that our delegation, fought for some of that funding or more of that funding to VTA to address our hardship challenges in light of all of the challenges we faced last year. And so there's, we just recently at our last meeting voted to supplant some of the funding, I think it's STA monies, to put into the Blue Ribbon Task Force. So in my mind, when we do that, I guess, and I have brought this up, is that, well, where is that funding best used? Is it best used, creating another, right, for lack of a better word, another level of bureaucracy? Or is it better used, putting out service to our riders? So I really want to, make sure we look at that and look at the most efficient way and, the cost-effective way of doing this without risking or taking away from, our real core job of providing service to the public. So I think there's that concern, and again, one size doesn't fit all. I think someone else brought it up. How do we account for the differences in our agencies, the self-help agencies, as Director Chavez often talks about? I was looking at like RM3 funding and how, Santa Clara County, we've always passed these sales tax measures to fund transit. But frankly, other counties, and I looked at RM3, for instance, and Solano County consistently does not pass sales taxes. And so, do we make up for that from our funds? And these are the bigger issues that I think we really have to take into consideration. I hope that will all come out of this study that MTC is moving forward and doing. And also just, wanted to ask our directors here to keep those thoughts in mind as we move forward at looking at what the best network management system or model, I should say, will be moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Jim, you want to make a comment?
Hi, thank you, Chair Jones. I appreciate it. And I just wanted to, compliment the points that a couple of the board members have made about our concerns. Earlier in this discussion, the point was brought up is, why are we only looking at one option here? And let me just give you a sense that there are many different options floating around at this time. The advocates have some, MTC has some, but it's important to also know that we've just seen, and one of the reasons we put this on your agenda for the workshop is that Senator Becker has recently introduced a bill, it's SB 917, and it does a lot of good things. It talks about all of the network management factors that we support, the fares, the wayfinding, the transfers. All of those are incredibly good things. It does say specifically that that will be done by MTC, and that if you don't do it, you being Board of Directors of VTA, then you will not be ineligible for your SDA funds, which is, we feel, a very serious issue. We are concerned because the governance, as you've heard Ms. Chavez say eloquently, is not representative of Santa Clara at MTC. That was a governance model that was formed in 1970. Population of the Bay Area was significantly different. So we are concerned about the governance model. We're concerned about the allocation of funding, and we're concerned that it will impact our riders, which is our primary concern. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do want to say, I just want to put stuff. I really thank those agents, the organizations, the county, the cities association, the mayor's office that, both board member Chavez, Mayor Liccardo, board member Abicoga, they actually sit on our board through our board allowing the actually wanting the board, the MTC commissioners to be an active member on our board. And, to actually have members that sit who understand VTA. Most of the region is not that lucky for the other 27 operators. There's no transit operators represented on the board, which is understandable when you have 27 operators or 26 operators in the region. So, but I do want to really say that that is so important, and they're doing, yeoman's job up there, woman's job up there, whatever, up there in terms of, our interests and really bringing an operator perspective that some of the other commissioners don't see.
Thank you, Director Liccardo.
Thank you, and I appreciate Carolyn's complimentary remarks about our Yo People's efforts. I just wanted to make sure I fully, and forgive the ignorance of my question here, Jim, because you started down this list, and I just want to be sure I have a complete clarity about what is our fear, what are the boogeymen, and it sounds like one is the loss of STA funding with non-compliance. Another is a lack of proportionate representation, though I know that's a loaded term. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what else do we fear?
Right. Sam, I think that's you've hit two of those concerns. Our third fear is being mandated to do something that we would have to take funds away from our daily operations on. One of the general managers at a recent meeting said, oh, well, who do they want me to fire? It was basically the response. As an example, one of the things that, as a concrete example, one of the things is to come up with a common format for data sharing for real-time ridership. Well, we do that, and we do that in a common format, but they could change that. And that would cost us money, that would cost us time, cost us disruption. At any rate, our concern is that this will impact our ridership and the people we have serving the public.
I'm sorry, it will affect our ridership because, just if you could complete that sentence.
Sure, because we would have to take funds away from our transit operation in order to fund some of these requirements. Sorry, I wasn't clear.
Yeah, no, you were. I just wasn't connecting all the dots. So. Thank you for that. I think all these concerns are obviously real, and I know we've been talking about them. I just want to make sure I was super clear about what you guys were thinking, because I don't think we've had this conversation offline, so it's good to have it online. I'm a little afraid of the perception VTA is the reputation we're getting of being not very good regional collaborators. And I think we all know that's in many ways not well-founded, given we are in a different position from many. And we're all very mindful of a history in which, as the county with the greatest population, we are clearly not batting our weight in terms of being able to get the same resources that other parts of the region are. So look, I think this is a situation where two things can be true. We've got lots of reasons to gripe. And secondly, that we're perceived as being the group that's always griping. I wonder if there's a path forward here where we can say yes and by that I mean, look, I think we all want regional collaboration to work. We all agree in greater uniformity, for example, of fare structures. We think it would promote seamless transportation. We know there's a lot of folks who live outside our county that need to work inside our county. And let's face it, all of our employers and our many parts of our community depend on those workers getting here. So it's not just about the folks who live here, it's about all the folks who contribute and participate in our community. And so even though I know we have a relatively small commute shed relative to the counties, I think we do want to be outward facing about this. And so I guess where I'm going with all of this is I'm hopeful that our message can be, yeah, we want to make this work, but here are our conditions under which we think we can make it work, rather than our message being kind of similar to what I suspect they're probably hearing from the other 27 operators, which is, hell no, you're just going to take my budget. Does anybody want to offer any thoughts about that?
And if I could just quickly respond, I think we are on the same page. We agree that these are good things and they are good things to do. And that's why we brought forward the general manager's proposal to implement this in a way that we think will make for a positive and successful implementation of these recommendations.
Thanks, Jim.
I think one of the things that's important is we want to do this in coordination with MTC. Is where it's not that we want, I think nobody, I don't think operators, I will say that probably we don't probably want another layer of governance somewhere. Because it does take time for us, and it's not that way, but we have, and it's going to have some costs to the operators, which is not the only reason why. We believe the things are good, but we think we can accomplish it the same way in coordination with MTC by creating some kind of board, because we have to do. I think MTC is the appropriate body to be right there, regional policy setting, working closely with us. They meet with all, they know us all. It wasn't that. It's just, but a lot of it is that transit agencies are very complicated organizations in terms of their funding mechanisms, the boards we all have, the authorities that we have. We're not even all created the same way. I mean, all those, right. And so it's hard to take that into account. So I think that was really the reason why the transit operators really want to be able to do it much more in coordination than have something come down, because we bring our points. We understand I guess we also understand each other. And what we have to go through. And, the other, usually a more governance board is not a transit operator, and they don't understand the nuances or the funding difficulties. We're not funded at the regional level. And I don't think that will ever happen a long time. Our funding sources are so diverse among us all that it makes it very difficult to see how that we could maybe accomplish it in 10, 20 years when all the legislation and votes go through, but it would be difficult. So
yeah, thanks, Karen.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands raised. So, sorry, Director Montano.
Thank you, Chair. So I've been listening to all of you, and I think you bring up some really good points. And I do understand that MTC wants to do some type of integrating some type of relevant transportation in the region, and I'm thinking this is the Bay Area counties, and you said there's 26. Are there 26 Bay Area counties?
No, there's 9. I'm sorry, Carolyn, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Scott.
Oh, I said there's 9 counties in the MTC region, and there's approximately 27 transit agencies in the.
Oh, okay, that's right. Good. Yeah. So, and then I heard earlier that Santa Clara County, the passengers are from Santa Clara County, so I'm wondering why we would be going to far-reaching into other counties, and because most of the transit users are from Santa Clara County. And then it takes me back to our local control. I mean, right now the state is trying to take away a lot of our local control in our cities, and I'm thinking maybe it's kind of synonymous with this. Well, my concern is we should be focusing on the Central Valley. A lot of folks are moving out to the Central Valley, and I don't know if MTC has regional authority in that area, but that's where folks are moving. They're moving out to the Central Valley. They're congesting our freeways because they want to come areas where their jobs are at. And I think we're just barking at the wrong tree. It just seems like we should be focusing on long regional, not regional, but outside the other counties, and like Tracy, for example. We have so many people moving out to Tracy, to all these other cities, because they want affordable housing, and affordable housing and transportation are, there's a symbiotic relationship there because they go hand in hand. And as I mentioned, many people are moving out to the Central Valley, and this impacting our transportation system on our freeways. So I think that's where we should be looking at, not so much, the Bay Area counties, but I'm not sure if MTC's their only role is in the Bay Area, MTC counties. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But I think we need better options. It's just like we're giving up too much, and the bottom line is Santa Clara County residents use Santa Clara County transportation. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands raised, so we are going to move on to item 2.2.x, Finance Function Assessment Overview. I've asked staff to provide a high-level overview so that the board can get a general understanding of the assessment scope, approach, and some of the next steps that were identified. This will help us get context when this item comes back to the board at a future workshop. General Manager Ganot will provide information on this item. Carolyn?
Actually, just to give a quick update, when we were in this search for the chief financial officer, I had actually done a search when I was at Utah Transit Authority as well. And I had actually put a finance transition assessment or assessment to use for the transition for the new CFO. And they found it very useful. And we did the same thing this time. Actually, Pat Hagan, who I think you know as from the previous, as a previous auditor general, as well as Corey Saunders, they did that work. We had them do the same thing when I came here to VTA to support of the new chief financial officers, so that something could be turned over, looking at best practices in the agency where we're at. It also helps support other efforts, tangential efforts that are going on. So just wanted to give a little bit of an update of what that assessment is about. Not the conclusions or anything that we found, but just so that we could, I guess you would call it more of a teaser. So I'm going to turn this over to Greg Richardson for a few words as well, the CFO.
Thank you, Carolyn. Yeah, I think as Carolyn put it, I mean, it's just more for us to make sure that the board, number one, was aware that this assessment was being done and that it was completed. And then as we develop more into the mechanics of what's going into it, that ultimately in another board workshop, we'll be able to go into a lot more greater detail into the actual assessment and some of the information that's in there. But today, again, to Carolyn's point, was more about a teaser. And if I could just say, you know, really how I'm looking at this is it's really to help leverage, you know, the work done to help prioritize efforts for me individually, but also for the department, not only the accounting finance arena, but also the overall VTA department. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pat and he can walk through just this brief overview and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all and good morning. Yes, myself and Corey Saunders have acted as independent consultants here. And if we'd advance to the next slide, I'll just give you an executive summary for today's discussion. So as the GM said, we really have tried to take an independent look at the finance function to support the onboarding of the new CFO with the thought of how can finance best support VTA's overall vision and operations. And as we went through this, and we'll talk a little bit more when we meet with you in more depth, we really were very sensitive to a number of the different issues that have impacted VTA within the last year and that you're all familiar with, so we won't cover those in more detail now. With regard to the work streams on the upper right-hand side of this slide, a sort of typical approach where we really did a fairly comprehensive document review. We did a number of interviews with some of the board members, with all the chiefs on the management team, with the key financial staff, and with union leadership, and we got some very good feedback and considered all that in aggregate confidentially in our evaluation as well. We also looked at job descriptions and considered best practices from APTA and other transit properties around the country, and as always, we came up with a series of recommendations. So broadly, the timing of the work was started toward the end of September of last year, about 2 months worth of time, and we concluded, and I think we presented to the chiefs on December 7th, which was perhaps Mr. Richardson's second day or so on the job. In terms of the conclusions, we'll speak to a little bit more depth next time we meet. But really, we felt that there was a collaborative desire to support a new CFO and the finance function, which was excellent. We did, as usual, come up with a number of different recommendations. So this really, in our opinion, is an opportunity to revisit the ways of working and communicating internally. So finance is clearly a key support function. It clearly cuts across the different departments within VTA, as Mr. Richardson mentioned. And so some of our observations may actually require some collaborative follow-up, across the other divisions as well. So the next steps for this session and for our overall report would be for the new CFO and the management team to consider the recommendations, come up with their own suggestions on priority and schedule. And then also some of these may be integrated into the general manager's overall VTA forward plan. So with that, next slide, please. This, as has been mentioned a couple of times, is really just a very, very, very high level preview of some of the topics that we'll discuss with you when we get together at the next workshop. And so you can see that the report and the deliverables were broken into 3 or 4 different areas. And part 1, we spent a fair amount of time looking at broadly the finance function in the organization. And there's 7 areas listed there. We came up with about 30 or so recommendations relating to those 7 areas. We'll talk in more detail about what each of those are, but you can see these are significant areas. You know, budget, the BART phase 2 project, people, key consideration, technology, key to support, organizational design, et cetera. So when we talk to you about the recommendations that we're suggesting on our next workshop, you'll see that these are really intended to drive process improvement, to help increase efficiency across the organization, to help leverage the technology that VTA owns and has paid for, and to help perhaps clarify some policies. So pretty robust, we think, broad set of recommendations. Part 2, financial health. We took a bit of a deeper dive from a municipal finance perspective, and we looked at some of the areas that were identified here, not individual audits of these areas by any means, but really looking at, for example, levels of debt, use of swaps, related policies, levels of capital assets, pension funding obligations, and funded ratios, et cetera. And we also risk ranked those for the new CFO's benefit. The third section in the lower left box on this slide, we conducted a pretty extensive finance function survey covering the 12 or so areas that are identified there. We had over 200 plus questions. We got about 15 responses. So we thank all of those management people that participated and gave us information. And really, this was designed to assess a couple different things. You know, one was the set of controls that's in place at VTA. The second was to solicit some user feedback, and we got a lot of good indications and perceptions of folks. And one of the key areas too that was helpful to us, we thought, was getting some feedback on the perception of finance as it operates within the organization. And so we provided all that information to the new CFO, and hopefully that will be usable going forward. And then we'll share with you next time a summary. Many of you are familiar with the heat map concept that we've used in the past, and that really attempts to just array the types of recommendations we've made by our suggested priority and over a suggested timeline. So certainly Mr. Richardson's already begun to look at some of these, and will have his own thoughts on these as we go forward, but we'll share these with you as well. So that is a very quick overview, and I suppose we can take, Mr. Chair or Madam GM, any questions if there are some.
Thank you, Pat.
Just to real quickly, one of the things for the CFOs, we have a number of vacancies in that department of managers through retirements or promotions to other jobs or other agencies. So this really also helps us take a look at, you know, what are we looking for? What are the type of people that we need to come in? What are the processes that we want to establish? So this was a big portion of that work as well.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. And again, thank you, Pat. As mentioned earlier, this was just a high-level overview of what's to come. My desire was that knowing that we're going to get really into the weeds in future discussions, that we wanted to at least give the board members some context and have you start at least thinking about these different areas so that you can be better prepared for that very detailed discussion. So now we're going to go to public comments. Rainey, do we have any requests to speak on this item?
We don't have any hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Bringing it back to the board. I don't see any hands raised. So we are going to go to our next item, which is other items. And we don't have any other items. That'll take us to our next item, which is announcements. Do we have any announcements? I don't see any hands raised, so that means our meeting is now adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic weekend.
Good weekend,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. We will end the meeting for all now.
All right.